If you have ever had the person you sacrificed everything for look you straight in the eye and throw you away like garbage, you know the exact moment your heart turns to ice. 3 days after I left the military hospital with our newborn twins, my husband walked through our front door. He was not holding the diapers or the formula he promised to buy. He was holding his wealthy boss. He tossed divorce papers onto my glass coffee table, smirked, and told me to sign them because she was pregnant. My mother-in-law screamed at me to take my babies and get out. I walked into the freezing snow with my twins. Months later, he turned on the television and froze. Before I share exactly how I destroyed his perfect new life, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe karma never misses an address. My name is Kendra. I am 32 years old, and until that freezing Tuesday afternoon, I thought I knew the man I married. I was standing in the center of our living room in suburban Maryland. My body was still aching terribly, the fresh C-section scars from delivering my twins, Malik and Maya, burning with a sharp, unrelenting heat with every breath I took. I was wearing an oversized gray sweatsuit, operating on maybe 2 hours of sleep, swaying slightly as I held Malik against my chest while Maya slept peacefully in her bassinet nearby. The house was quiet. I was just waiting for the sound of Jamal's key in the lock, trusting that my husband of 5 years was rushing home to help his recovering wife. The front door swung open, bringing in a biting gust of winter air. I turned around, a tired but genuine smile forming on my lips, expecting to see Jamal loaded down with the bags of newborn essentials he had left to buy 2 hours ago. That smile died instantly. Jamal walked in casually, brushing snow off his tailored wool coat, but his hands were completely empty, and he was not alone. Clinging tightly to his arm was Valerie. Valerie was 42 years old and the CEO of the defense contracting firm where Jamal worked. She stepped into my living room dripping in Van Cleef jewelry, her pristine designer boots clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She looked at me, a woman 3 days postpartum, and physically exhausted with a mixture of amusement and utter disdain. Jamal did not look guilty. He did not look ashamed. He looked incredibly arrogant, puffing out his chest as he guided Valerie into our home like he was giving her a grand tour of a property he had just conquered. "What is going on?" I asked, my voice raspy and low, so I would not wake the babies. I shifted Malik carefully in my arms, the physical pain in my abdomen flaring up as a knot of pure dread formed in my stomach. "Where are the diapers, Jamal?" Jamal let out a short, dismissive laugh that echoed through the living room. He reached inside his coat pocket, pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, and tossed them carelessly onto the glass coffee table. They landed with a heavy thud right next to a stack of unopened mail. "I am not here for diapers, Kendra," he said, his tone dripping with an unearned superiority. "I am here to finalize things. Those are divorce papers. I need you to sign them today." The room immediately started to spin. I looked from the papers to him, then to Valerie, who was busy examining her flawless manicure, as if tearing apart a family was just another mundane corporate transaction for her. "Divorce papers." I repeated the words, feeling thick and completely foreign in my mouth. "I just brought our children home from the military hospital. Malik and Maya are 3 days old. And that is exactly why we are doing this cleanly right now," Jamal replied, stepping closer, though he kept a protective arm hovering near Valerie. "Look, Kendra, let us be realistic. This little domestic life-playing house in the suburbs while you sit around collecting your little military checks, it is not working for me anymore. I am a vice president now. I am a startup executive. I need a partner who matches my ambition, someone who operates on my level." I stared at the man I had loved, the man I had financially and emotionally supported through years of failed business ventures, missed car payments, and endless, empty promises. The sheer audacity of his delusion sent a shockwave of cold clarity through my veins, temporarily numbing the burning pain of my surgical scars. "Your level," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, steady calm. "Jamal, you are playing executive at her company. And let us be very clear about how this house is funded. My VA disability checks from my time in cyber intelligence are the exact and only reason this mortgage gets paid every month. You have not contributed a single dime to this household in 4 years. You are standing under a roof my military service paid for." Valerie let out a soft, mocking sigh and finally looked at me directly. "Oh, please," she purred, her voice dripping with extreme condescension. "Do not embarrass yourself by clinging to a house. Jamal is destined for executive boardrooms and international acquisitions, not arguing over mortgage payments with a discharged veteran. We are moving forward to bigger things." Jamal puffed his chest out even further, clearly emboldened by his wealthy sponsor, validating his massive ego. He looked at me, his eyes completely devoid of any love history or compassion we had ever shared. He gestured aggressively toward the legal documents on the table. "Sign it, Kendra," he demanded, a cruel smirk playing on his lips as he looked down at me and his newborn son. "Valerie is pregnant. She is actually giving me the lifestyle I deserve, and I am not going to let you or these kids drag me down." I barely had time to process the sheer sickness of Jamal using our innocent babies as a punchline when the sharp clinking of a crystal glass against a wedding band broke the silence. The sound came from the kitchen. My kitchen. The exact kitchen I had painstakingly remodeled using the signing bonus from my last military deployment. The heavy wooden swinging door pushed open, and Brenda strolled into the living room. My mother-in-law was wearing a silk floral robe I had bought her for Mother's Day, holding a freshly poured mimosa in her right hand. The bright orange juice and expensive champagne practically glowed in the afternoon light. She took a slow, deliberate sip, acting as if she were attending a Sunday brunch, rather than standing over the burning wreckage of my marriage. I truly expected a grandmother's outrage. I expected Brenda to drop her crystal glass rush over to the bassinet and absolutely light into her son for bringing his mistress into the home where her brand new grandchildren were resting. Instead, she offered Valerie a warm, welcoming smile. It was the exact kind of performative, fawning smile she usually reserved for the head pastor at our church or a wealthy neighbor she wanted to impress. Then she turned her gaze to me, and that warm smile vanished completely, leaving behind a mask of pure, cold contempt. "You heard my son, Kendra," Brenda said, her voice devoid of a single ounce of empathy or grace. "Do not just stand there looking pathetic in your sweatpants. Sign the papers and let the man breathe." I clutched Malik tighter against my chest, feeling his tiny, fragile heartbeat thumping rapidly against my own racing pulse. "Brenda," I said, my voice cracking slightly despite my absolute best efforts to maintain my military bearing. "You are standing here watching your son abandon his 3-day-old twins for his boss, and you are casually drinking a mimosa." Brenda let out a sharp, condescending laugh that grated against my ears. She glided across the hardwood floor and stood right beside Valerie, forming a united front of absolute financial toxicity. "I am watching my son finally step into his true purpose," Brenda corrected me, wagging a manicured acrylic nail in my direction. "Jamal is a visionary. He deserves a woman who can elevate him to the exclusive circles he actually belongs in." Valerie is a chief executive officer. She has summer homes in the Hamptons and access to a private jet. What exactly do you have, Kendra? You are nothing but a discharged cyber analyst. You sit in a dark room, typing on a keyboard, collecting a government check, while pretending you are building an empire. You cannot give my son a high society life, and it is entirely selfish of you to hold him back." The sheer audacity of her statement hit me harder than the physical pain radiating from my surgical incisions. I had spent the last 4 years paying off Brenda's massive credit card debt. I had funded the lavish 50th birthday party she bragged about to her friends for months. And now she was discarding me, the exact second someone with a larger bank account walked through the front door. "My government checks paid for that mimosa in your hand," I shot back, my voice dropping an octave, channeling the strict command presence I used to lead intelligence briefings overseas. "My keyboard typing kept the foreclosure notices off this property, while your visionary son played golf on Tuesday afternoons trying to look important." Valerie rolled her eyes, inspecting the massive diamond ring on her finger. "Oh, please spare us the tired martyr routine. It is so utterly lower middle class." Brenda nodded in furious agreement, completely enamored by Valerie's display of wealth. "Exactly. You always had this rigid, aggressive military attitude, Kendra. It is completely exhausting. Jamal needs softness. He needs luxury and refinement. He does not need a drill sergeant who tracks every penny and makes him feel small just because she pays a few bills. I looked at Jamal, who was standing tall, puffing out his chest as two women fought over his fragile ego. He was not a prize. He was a parasite jumping to a much larger host. But before I could even tell them, they deserved each other. Brenda took a step closer to the coffee table and tapped her fingernail against the glass top. "Since we are getting all the ugly business out of the way today," Brenda said, her eyes narrowing with blatant, unhidden greed, "Jamal is going to need the keys to the SUV." I stared at her, completely bewildered by the sudden chaotic shift in demands. My SUV. The one I bought in cash before I even met him. "It is a marital asset," Jamal interjected, quickly finding his voice now that his mother was actively fighting his battles for him. "I need a reliable luxury vehicle that fits my new executive profile. Valerie and I have important corporate retreats to attend, and I cannot show up driving my old sedan. Besides, you will not be needing a luxury car where you are going." "You are out of your mind," I said, stepping back toward the bassinet where Maya was just starting to stir and whimper. "You are not touching my car. I need it for the babies." Brenda scoffed, waving her mimosa in the air dismissively, splashing a few drops of champagne onto the rug. "Take the sedan. Or take the city bus for all I care. Jamal needs the SUV for his new image. Valerie is introducing him to state senators and foreign investors next week. You cannot expect a man of his caliber to drive around in a piece of junk." The absolute delusion in that room was suffocating. They actually believed they could strip me of my dignity, my marriage, my home, and my vehicle, all while I stood there bleeding and exhausted. They thought my silence was weakness. They thought my lack of screaming meant I was defeated. They had completely forgotten the kind of woman I was before I put on the soft apron of a suburban housewife. You do not survive deep-cover cyber warfare by throwing temper tantrums. You survive by assessing the threat, securing your primary assets, and neutralizing the enemy with precise, calculated strikes. I gently laid Malik down next to his sister in the bassinet, making sure they were safe. I stood up straight, pulling my shoulders back, ignoring the searing, pulling pain in my lower stomach. I looked directly into Brenda's eyes, then shifted my icy gaze to Jamal, and finally to Valerie. They were waiting for me to break down. They were waiting for the desperate, loud tears of a discarded wife. Instead, I reached into my sweatsuit pocket and pulled out the heavy electronic key fob to my SUV. Jamal's eyes lit up with immediate victory, reaching his greedy hand out to take it from me. But I did not hand it to him. I gripped it tightly in my fist, letting the heavy silence stretch until the tension in the living room became practically unbearable. "You want my car?" I said softly, my voice dangerously calm and terrifyingly hollow. "You want to play executive while your mother drinks my champagne and your boss buys your loyalty." Brenda slammed her crystal glass down on the kitchen island, spilling orange juice across the expensive marble I paid for. She marched right up to me, her face twisted with a vicious, hateful sneer. She pointed a sharp, shaking finger directly at the front door. "You heard him," Brenda yelled, her shrill voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Take your baggage and get out of my son's house." I did not shed a single tear. I did not drop to my knees and beg for my family to stay intact. The woman they expected to break had died the second that door opened. I turned my back on Brenda's pointing finger and walked with absolute precision toward the glass coffee table. I picked up the heavy silver pen Jamal had strategically placed beside the stack of divorce documents. I flipped directly to the last signature page. My hand did not shake. The ink flowed smoothly across the dotted line, permanently severing me from the parasite I had been carrying for 5 years. I tossed the pen onto the table where it clattered loudly against the glass. I looked up at Jamal. He was grinning like he had just won the lottery. "You do realize my VA disability check is the exact and only thing keeping this house out of foreclosure, right?" I asked, my voice a flat, emotionless monotone. I pointed at the stack of unopened mail with bright red final notice stamps peeking through the window envelopes. "You are 3 months behind. The bank is going to take this property by spring." Jamal threw his head back and let out a booming, arrogant laugh. He pulled Valerie flush against his side, planting a kiss on her temple. Foreclosure, he mocked, shaking his head at my apparent ignorance. Kendra, you are thinking too small. You are thinking like a struggling veteran. Valerie is not just my fiancée, she is my financial savior. She is already putting the down payment on a massive commercial real estate portfolio in my name. We are not worried about a starter home in the suburbs. We are building generational wealth. Valerie patted his chest affectionately, shooting me a pitying look. We will send you a postcard from the Amalfi Coast, Kendra. Best of luck with the government assistance. I did not waste another breath on either of them. I turned away and knelt beside the double bassinet. My surgical incisions screamed in protest, sending sharp, radiating flares of agony through my lower abdomen. But adrenaline is a remarkable anesthetic. I carefully lifted Malik, securing him into his infant car seat, and then did the same for Maya. They slept right through the destruction of their family, entirely unaware of the monsters standing just feet away. I slung the heavy diaper bag over my shoulder and gripped the handles of both car seats. Lifting them simultaneously required every ounce of physical strength I possessed, but I refused to show any sign of struggle. I walked past Jamal, past Valerie, and past my former mother-in-law without a single backwards glance. I pushed the heavy front door open and stepped out into the freezing winter air. The biting wind hit my face like a physical strike, and there waiting for me on the icy, snow-covered concrete steps was Chloe. My brother-in-law's wife had clearly rushed over the second Brenda texted her about the ambush. She stood there shivering slightly in her thin Lululemon leggings and a designer puffer vest, holding a steaming cup of expensive coffee. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and a nasty, knowing smirk played across her lips. She blocked the top of the stairs, looking down at me and the two heavy car seats I was carrying. Chloe reached into the pocket of her vest and pulled out a crumpled $20 bill. She extended her hand, holding the wrinkled currency out toward me, with an expression of exaggerated, toxic sympathy. "Here, Kendra," she cooed, her voice loud enough for the people inside the house to hear. "Take this for an Uber to a women's shelter. It is freezing out here. Make sure the babies wear hats so they do not catch a cold on the bus." I looked at the crumpled $20 bill, and then directly into Chloe's pale eyes. I completely ignored her outstretched hand. I adjusted my grip on the car seats, stepped right past her, forcing her to scramble out of my way to avoid being knocked off the icy steps, and walked straight to my paid-off luxury SUV parked in the driveway. The heavy thud of the car doors shutting felt like a vault ceiling. I started the engine, cranking the heat to warm the interior for Malik and Maya. I shifted the car into reverse and pulled out into the snow-covered street, leaving the house, Jamal, Valerie, Brenda, and Chloe in my rearview mirror. The moment my vehicle turned the corner and their house was completely out of sight, the heavy, suffocating weight of playing the victim vanished. The slight tremble in my hands stopped. The tears that had threatened to fall evaporated. My demeanor turned to absolute ice. The mourning period was officially over, and the tactical phase had begun. The tires of my paid-off luxury SUV crushed the fresh snow as I navigated the winding roads away from the suburban nightmare I used to call home. I did not head toward the crowded city shelters Chloe had so mockingly suggested on my front porch. Instead, I merged onto the highway and drove straight to the most exclusive extended-stay luxury suites in downtown Bethesda. The discreet concierge greeted me by name the second I walked through the revolving glass doors and immediately directed his staff to assist with my babies. I had secured the penthouse suite 3 weeks ago, long before Jamal ever dropped his divorce papers on my coffee table. I had trusted the same sharp gut instinct that kept me alive during my military deployments overseas. I swiped my heavy metal premium card at the front desk, using an account funded entirely by royalties my husband and his greedy mother knew absolutely nothing about. The penthouse was immaculate and perfectly warm. Massive windows overlooked the glittering city skyline, and the climate-controlled nursery was already completely stocked with premium cribs, organic formula, and every single necessity Malik and Maya could possibly need. As I gently laid my sleeping twins into their soft beds, my phone began to vibrate violently against the marble kitchen island. I walked over and picked it up. The notifications were flooding in from the family group chat. They had deliberately left me in the chat just to ensure I could witness their cruel celebration. Chloe sent a picture of Brenda holding up her mimosa with a caption saying the trash finally took itself out and hoping that $20 buys a warm blanket. Jamal chimed in right after her. He bragged that Valerie was having her elite interior designer come over tomorrow morning to turn the twins' nursery into a state-of-the-art home gym. He told me not to bother coming back for my cheap clothes because he was throwing them all in the dumpster. Brenda added the final killing blow, typing that she always knew I was a massive drain on her son, and that at least now he has a real woman who can fund his grand vision. I read their venomous words with a detached and clinical precision. They honestly believed I was a broken, penniless veteran crying in a cold car parked on the side of the road. They had mistaken my calm silence for weak submission, completely unaware that in my world, silence is just the final stage of target acquisition. I had kept my true wealth a secret for a very good reason. Jamal had a long documented history of blowing money on terrible startup ideas and shady investments. If he had known I was a multimillionaire, he would have drained my accounts dry to fund his endless delusions of grandeur. I hid the money to protect my future and to protect my children. I turned off the phone screen, placed it face down on the marble, and walked over to my heavy leather travel bag. I bypassed the standard civilian laptop Jamal thought I used for browsing the internet and pulled out a heavy matte black secure military terminal. I booted the system, watching the familiar lines of encrypted code cascade down the screen. I connected a specialized earpiece and initiated a voice-over internet protocol call, routing it through 3 heavily secured private servers in different hemispheres to ensure absolute privacy. The line clicked open, and a deep, authoritative voice answered immediately. "Sterling here. Go ahead." "General Sterling," I said, my voice dropping back into the clipped, formal tone of my active duty days. "It is Kendra." General Sterling was my former commanding officer and a trusted mentor. His tone softened marginally, though he maintained his professional edge. "Kendra," he said, sounding surprised. "I heard you just had the twins. I was expecting a birth announcement, not a secure communications activation. Is everything all right?" "The situation has permanently changed," General I replied, my eyes fixed on the glowing monitor. "I need a real-time status update on Valerie Sterling and her defense contracting firm. Specifically, I need the status of their licensing agreement for the Aegis Core encryption framework." There was a heavy pause on the line. General Sterling knew exactly what I was asking, because he was one of the only 3 people on Earth who actually knew the truth about Aegis Core. When my mother-in-law mocked my career, reducing me to a discharged cyber analyst typing in a dark room, she failed to realize the magnitude of what I was actually building. 5 years ago, during my final deployment, I engineered a proprietary encryption algorithm so advanced that the Department of Defense mandated its immediate use across all Tier 1 military contractors. I was not just a veteran, I was the sole anonymous patent holder of Aegis Core. Valerie and her entire billion-dollar contracting empire relied entirely on a foundation that I personally owned and leased to her company through a blind proxy corporation. General Sterling pulled up the restricted files on his end, the sound of his rapid typing echoing through my earpiece. "Valerie and her firm are currently fully reliant on your architecture, Kendra," he explained. "In fact, they are highly vulnerable right this exact second. They just submitted their software license renewal packet this morning. They are bidding on a massive exclusive Pentagon defense contract worth $500 million. They absolutely need the Aegis Core license active to pass their mandatory federal security audit tomorrow morning. If they do not have that active license, they automatically lose the bid, and they will immediately lose their current security clearance." I walked slowly back over to the nursery door and looked at my beautiful sleeping twins. I thought about Jamal aggressively tossing those divorce papers on the glass table. I thought about Valerie flaunting her jewelry while standing in the center of my living room. I thought about Brenda telling me to take my baggage and get out into the freezing snow. They wanted high society. They wanted corporate acquisitions. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of power and money with a woman they assumed was entirely powerless. I took a deep breath, my eyes locking onto the dark winter sky outside the penthouse windows. "Revoke her license immediately," I ordered, my voice ringing with absolute chilling authority. Protocol Delta. 2 weeks passed in absolute undisturbed silence. I did not send a single text message. I did not make a single phone call. I let Jamal and Valerie steep in their arrogant delusion, fully believing they had cleanly disposed of me and my children. From the comfort of my luxury penthouse, while Malik and Maya slept soundly in their premium temperature-controlled cribs, I sat before my secure terminal and watched the digital clock tick down. Valerie's defense contracting firm operated entirely on the Aegis Core encryption framework. It was the digital heartbeat of her billion-dollar empire, the exact and only reason the Pentagon trusted her company with highly classified military intelligence. And at exactly 9 in the morning on a Tuesday, her temporary user license officially expired. I did not hit a dramatic red button. I simply typed a single heavily encrypted command line of code and pressed enter. The result was instantaneous. Across the city in Valerie's sleek glass-walled corporate headquarters, every single server workstation and communication relay tied to the Department of Defense went completely black. The screens locked out, displaying a sterile, blinking error message indicating a catastrophic authentication failure. I monitored the internal network traffic through a legally integrated security backdoor I had engineered into the framework years ago. The panic spiked within seconds. Data packets collided violently as their technology department scrambled to reboot systems, entirely unaware that rebooting a military-grade cryptographic lockout is exactly like throwing water on a grease fire. Right as the digital blackout initiated, Valerie was hosting her pivotal quarterly executive board meeting. Through the intercepted audio files from the boardroom's smart hub, I had a front-row seat to the absolute meltdown occurring inside her headquarters. Valerie had just proudly introduced Jamal to her board of directors as the brilliant new vice president of cyber operations. She had handed him a massive six-figure salary, a corner office, and an elite title he could not even spell, much less execute. When the massive presentation screens in their boardroom suddenly flashed dark red with federal lockout warnings, the room descended into total chaos. The board members, representing hundreds of millions in high-stakes shareholder investments, immediately turned their attention to Jamal. They expected their newly minted vice president to step up and mitigate the massive crisis unfolding before their eyes. Instead, Jamal stood frozen at the head of the conference table, sweating profusely through his expensive tailored suit, staring blankly at the rolling error codes. I listened to my ex-husband completely humiliate himself in real time. He started throwing around useless, outdated corporate buzzwords, telling the board they just needed to clear the system cache and restart the mainframe. He frantically suggested unplugging the routers to reset the local network. The board members, seasoned military contractors, and ruthless tech investors listened in stunned silence as they realized Valerie had jeopardized their entire company to hire an incompetent, underqualified boy toy. One of the senior board members, a retired Navy admiral with zero tolerance for incompetence, pounded his heavy fist on the mahogany table. His booming voice was captured perfectly on my audio feed. He demanded to know why the supposed chief of cyber operations was suggesting they unplug a basic internet router during a highly classified federal security breach. Jamal stammered uncontrollably, his voice cracking as he desperately tried to look toward Valerie for a lifeline. But Valerie was too busy frantically texting her lead software engineers, her pristine image cracking under the immense pressure. I sat back in my plush leather chair, sipping a warm cup of premium coffee, thoroughly enjoying the beautiful symphony of their panic. Jamal tried to assert dominance, raising his voice to tell the board that he would personally go down to the server room and physically bypass the security firewall. The sheer unadulterated stupidity of his statement caused an actual uproar among the executives. "You cannot physically bypass a cloud-based algorithmic encryption designed specifically to withstand targeted attacks from hostile foreign nations. He was exposing his absolute lack of foundational technical knowledge to the most powerful, unforgiving people in the entire defense sector. Valerie's professional credibility was evaporating by the second. She had aggressively vouched for him, elevated his status over actual experts, and tied her entire professional reputation to his supposed genius. Now he was rapidly sinking her billion-dollar ship, dragging her legacy down into the depths of a massive federal investigation. The beautiful climax of their morning arrived when the heavy double doors of the executive boardroom burst open. The actual head of their technology department, a frantic, overworked man running on zero sleep, sprinted into the room completely out of breath. I watched the system logs peak as he delivered the fatal, undeniable blow to their egos. He ignored Jamal entirely, treating him like the ghost he essentially was in that department, and looked straight at Valerie. The tech lead announced that this was not a temporary glitch or a minor server failure. The anonymous holding company that legally owned the Aegis core architecture had officially pulled their entire operating license with zero warning and zero room for negotiation. They were permanently locked out of all Department of Defense servers. Furthermore, he added, if they did not somehow magically restore the complex encryption protocol within exactly 72 hours, the Pentagon would automatically initiate a massive, invasive federal audit of their entire contracting firm. The audio feed peaked sharply as the room erupted into shouting. Valerie lost every single ounce of her refined, high society composure. Her meticulously crafted image shattered into a million pieces. She stood up violently, her heavy leather chair crashing to the floor behind her, and screamed at Jamal at the top of her lungs. Her voice echoed with pure, unadulterated terror as she demanded to know how he could possibly let this happen to her company, entirely unaware that the architect of her destruction was listening to every single word. I reached out and gently tapped a single key on my mechanical keyboard, lowering the volume of Valerie's frantic screaming to a muted digital hum. The acoustic paneling of my massive sunroom absorbed the ambient sound entirely, leaving me in absolute perfect tranquility. I sat back in my custom ergonomic chair, letting the brilliant afternoon sunlight wash over me through the floor-to-ceiling UV-filtered glass. Beyond the glass stretched 10 acres of pristine, heavily wooded property, completely enclosed by a 10-foot wrought iron security gate. I had purchased this estate 3 days after walking out of my former living room. I did not bother with financing mortgage applications or real estate contingencies. I wired the exact asking price in a single untraceable cash transaction using a microscopic fraction of the quarterly royalties generated by Aegis Core. Malik and Maya were asleep in their adjacent custom nursery, monitored by a state-of-the-art closed-circuit system that I had personally encrypted. I had no mortgage hanging over my head. I had no parasite draining my bank accounts. I had nothing but the quiet, steady hum of true generational wealth, and the exquisite satisfaction of watching my enemies orchestrate their own spectacular demise. My encrypted terminal showed Valerie's corporate network effectively bleeding to death, but it was the violent vibration of my personal cell phone that drew my immediate attention. The screen illuminated with rapid-fire notifications from the family group chat. In their absolute arrogance, they had never actually removed me from the text thread. They kept me in it specifically to ensure I could witness their manufactured high society luxury. Now I was witnessing the exact opposite. Chloe was typing in frantic, aggressive capital letters. She was currently standing at the checkout counter of a high-end designer boutique downtown. She and Brenda had apparently decided to celebrate Jamal's new executive status with a massive luxury shopping spree on a Tuesday afternoon. Chloe sent a blurry photo of a declined credit card terminal. The message below it was dripping with toxic outrage. She demanded to know why Jamal's newly issued corporate platinum card had just violently declined a $14,000 transaction for designer handbags and celebratory champagne. Brenda immediately replied, her text bubble popping up seconds later. My former mother-in-law was furious, entirely humiliated by the cashier and the wealthy patrons staring at them. She typed that the machine must be broken and ordered Jamal to call the bank immediately to clear the fraud alert, because she refused to walk out of the store empty-handed like a common peasant. She told Jamal to stop playing games and fix the card right now so she could maintain her dignity. Jamal, of course, did not respond. He could not respond. He was currently standing in a locked boardroom surrounded by furious military contractors being verbally eviscerated by the woman who was supposed to be his golden ticket. I turned the volume on the boardroom audio feed back up. Valerie was not just screaming anymore. She was executing rapid, aggressive damage control. I listened as she barked orders at her finance director, instructing him to instantly freeze every single secondary corporate account and halt all outgoing executive expenditures to preserve operating capital. That included the platinum card Jamal had so foolishly handed his mother and sister-in-law that morning. Valerie was watching her billion-dollar valuation evaporate in real time, and her immediate reaction was to ruthlessly cut off the dead weight. Jamal tried to interrupt her, begging her not to freeze the cards, because his mother was currently at the register. The sheer audacity of his priority in the middle of a catastrophic cyber crisis caused the retired Navy admiral to let out a sound of pure, unadulterated disgust. The admiral demanded that Jamal be physically removed from the boardroom, immediately citing him as a massive security liability who clearly had absolutely no idea how a defense contracting firm operated. Jamal stammered, trying to apologize, but Valerie did not even look at him. She coldly signaled the guards. The sound of heavy wooden doors opening and Jamal being forcibly escorted out by corporate security was absolute music to my ears. He was entirely useless to her now. I looked down at my phone. The group chat was spiraling into pure panic. Chloe texted that the boutique manager was threatening to call the police because Brenda was causing a massive scene and throwing display items. Brenda sent a voice note, her tone completely devoid of its usual arrogant drawl, begging Jamal to pick up the phone because her own personal debit cards were bouncing. The financial facade was cracking rapidly, exposing the absolute bankrupt reality of their existence. But the true masterpiece of the afternoon was yet to arrive. As the boardroom doors clicked shut, leaving Valerie alone with her panicked executives and enraged board members, a high-priority alert chimed across my secure terminal. It was a direct, heavily encrypted transmission from the Department of Defense, automatically carbon copied to the Aegis Corps patent holder network. I watched the text populate on my screen mere seconds before it hit Valerie's main server. It was a formal, automated federal notification. The Pentagon had officially detected the unauthorized presence on the network due to the license revocation. The text was cold clinical and absolutely devastating. Valerie's firm was given exactly 72 hours to restore the authorized military-grade encryption protocol. If the system was not fully compliant and active by the deadline, the Department of Defense would officially terminate all existing contracts, instantly strip the firm of its security clearances, and dispatch a team of federal agents to conduct a comprehensive forensic audit of her entire corporate infrastructure. The heavy oak doors of the Oakmont Country Club opened with a quiet rush of conditioned air and the faint scent of expensive cedar. This was the exact establishment Valerie used as her personal stage to flaunt her defense contracting wealth. It was where she brought Jamal to parade him around her elite social circle. And it was exactly where I needed to be to execute the next phase of my operation. I handed the keys of my luxury SUV to the valet, smoothing the lapels of my custom-tailored emerald green power suit. I paired it with gold hardware and a flawless blowout. I did not look like a discarded wife who had given birth to twins a mere month ago. I looked like absolute predatory wealth. I was guided by the hostess to a reserved private booth right in the center of the main dining room. I sat down and opened my leather portfolio to review the secondary licensing contracts my financial manager had prepared. But I did not have to look far to find my targets. 2 tables away, sitting in the harsh midday sunlight, was the entire fraudulent ensemble. Jamal, Valerie, Brenda, and Chloe were gathered around a circular table, and the visual contrast to their previous arrogance was absolutely staggering. They looked entirely miserable. The crushing stress of the 72-hour Department of Defense audit warning was clearly eating them alive. Valerie sat rigidly, her posture tight, her face pale and drawn with deep dark circles under her eyes. She was aggressively whispering at Jamal, her manicured finger tapping furiously against the white tablecloth. Jamal looked like a cornered animal. He was sweating through a wrinkled dress shirt, running his hands over his face, completely unable to provide her with the technical miracle she desperately needed. Brenda and Chloe were no longer celebrating generational wealth. Without Valerie picking up the tab and with Jamal's corporate cards frozen solid, the reality of their situation had aggressively set in. Brenda was glaring at the menu with open disgust, nursing a simple glass of tap water instead of her usual afternoon champagne. Chloe sat beside her, looking incredibly tense, picking nervously at a plain side salad. They were completely stripped of their false superiority, rapidly turning on each other as the financial ship went down. I calmly sipped my sparkling water and turned a page in my portfolio, completely ignoring their existence. My silence, however, was not something Chloe could tolerate. The second her pale eyes scanned the room and locked onto my emerald suit, she froze. Her jaw actually dropped. She nudged Brenda aggressively, pointing directly at my booth. Brenda whipped her head around, and her eyes bulged out of her skull. They had fully expected me to be rotting in a state-funded women's shelter, begging for government handouts. Seeing me radiating absolute health power and unbothered luxury shattered their fragile egos. Chloe immediately decided to project her massive insecurity. She needed to drag me down to claw back a tiny fraction of the power they were rapidly losing. She sat up straight, raised her voice, and waved her hand wildly to flag down a nearby waitress. "Excuse me, Miss Chloe," projected her shrill voice echoing clearly across the quiet dining room. "I think there has been a massive security breach at the front desk. Do you let shelter residents dine here now? I thought this club had strict standards for its clientele." The entire dining room went dead silent. The low murmur of wealthy patrons stopped instantly as heads turned toward our tables. Jamal snapped his head up from his hands, his eyes locking onto me. All the color instantly drained from his face. Valerie stopped her frantic whispering and stared at me in complete, unadulterated shock. She looked at my pristine emerald suit, at the heavy gold watch on my wrist, at the thick stack of premium corporate documents resting on my table. This was not the broken, crying veteran she had mocked in my living room. This was a woman completely out of her league. The waitress, a young woman with a polite but highly uncomfortable expression, stepped toward Chloe, trying to diffuse the loud confrontation. "Ma'am, I assure you every guest here is a verified member," the waitress said quietly. Chloe sneered, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "Well, you might want to check her credit score before you let her order the lobster. She is completely broke." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not engage in a pathetic shouting match with a woman whose entire existence revolved around her husband's credit limit. I calmly closed my leather portfolio and slid it into my designer bag. I signaled my waitress, requesting the check for my sparkling water and appetizers. She brought the black leather folder over immediately, apologizing quietly for the disturbance. I opened the folder and pulled out a solid black titanium card. It was not a standard credit card. It was the exclusive ultra-high net worth tier card issued only to individuals holding 8 figures in liquid assets. It clanked heavily against the table. I signed the receipt with a steady hand. I stood up, the crisp fabric of my suit falling perfectly into place. The entire room watched me in stunned silence as I walked with slow, deliberate precision straight toward Valerie's table. Jamal shrank back into his chair, looking absolutely terrified. Valerie gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. Chloe tried to maintain her arrogant smirk, but her eyes betrayed her rising panic. I did not look at Jamal. I did not look at Valerie or Chloe. I walked directly to where Brenda was sitting, staring up at me with her mouth hanging slightly open. I reached into the pocket of my suit jacket. I pulled out 5 crisp, brand-new $100 bills. I stopped right next to Brenda's shoulder, making sure the entire table and the hovering waitress had a perfectly clear view of my hands. I looked at the waitress, maintaining a voice of absolute chilling calm. "Thank you for your excellent service today," I said. I dropped the $500 directly onto the center of their table, right in front of Brenda's face. "Keep the change. It looks like the people at this table are having some severe liquidity issues today. Make sure they get something warm to eat." The 5 crisp $100 bills sat on the pristine white tablecloth, radiating an undeniable absolute mockery. Brenda stared at Benjamin Franklin's face as if the paper itself had just reached up and slapped her across the jaw. Her usual arrogant sneer dissolved completely, leaving her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. She had spent the last decade treating me like an unpaid servant, entirely convinced I was financially beneath her. Now she was staring at more cash than she currently had access to, and it had been casually discarded in front of her like pocket change. Chloe sat frozen beside her mother, the heavy silence of the dining room pressing down on her shoulders. Her pale eyes darted nervously around, taking in the wealthy patrons, who were now openly staring at our table. She tried to stammer out a response, desperate to claw back a tiny fraction of the power they were rapidly losing. She opened her mouth to hurl another insult, but the words died in her throat as I turned my full, unwavering attention directly to her. I looked at Chloe and replied with a voice that sliced through the tension like a scalpel. "I did find a shelter. I bought the building and turned it into a tech incubator. Keep the $20 you offered me. It looks like your husband's accounts are frozen." Jamal had just practically sprinted into the dining room, clearly desperate to do damage control with his mother and sister-in-law after his spectacular boardroom humiliation. He stopped dead in his tracks. He stared at me, absolutely bewildered by my appearance and the heavy private security detail standing directly behind me. 2 men had silently materialized at my flanks the moment I stood up from my booth. They were not country club staff. They were elite private tactical operatives dressed in tailored charcoal suits, with discreet earpieces, custom contracted through my wealth management firm. They radiated lethal professionalism, standing like twin monoliths entirely focused on my safety. Jamal's eyes darted from the flawless emerald silk of my lapel to the heavy gold watch on my wrist, and finally to the security team treating me like a high-value asset. He could not comprehend the sheer magnitude of the power dynamic shift. Valerie sat rigidly at the head of the table, her meticulous composure completely shattering. The words about frozen accounts echoed in her mind, snapping her back to the catastrophic reality of her mourning. She looked at the solid black titanium card I had just used to pay my tab. It was an ultra-high net worth tier card issued exclusively to individuals holding massive liquid assets. Valerie was a defense contractor. She built her entire identity on assessing threats and understanding corporate leverage. A sickening realization began to wash over her pale face. She knew her military network had just been locked down by the anonymous architect of the Aegis Core framework. Now she was staring directly at the woman she had mocked and displaced, a woman suddenly wielding infinite wealth and untouchable power. Valerie was putting the pieces together, and the resulting picture was her absolute worst nightmare. Jamal could not process the layers of his own destruction. His fragile ego completely short-circuited. He had spent his entire adult life convincing himself I was nothing but a subservient dependent, entirely reliant on his mediocre income and basic approval. Seeing me command a room full of millionaires guarded by elite security and casually dropping cash to feed his mother broke his reality into jagged pieces. He stood up violently, knocking his heavy wooden chair backward into a passing waiter. The clatter of dropping silverware echoed loudly, but Jamal ignored it entirely. His chest heaved as he pointed a shaking finger at me, his voice cracking under the immense pressure of his failures. He demanded to know what I was doing here. He accused me of stalking him, screaming that I was trying to ruin his new life out of petty jealousy. He started yelling about Valerie's company, complaining that the Pentagon was threatening them with a federal audit. and somehow irrationally trying to blame me for the technical glitch that got him thrown out of the boardroom. He was spiraling, desperately projecting his incompetence onto me in front of the most powerful people in the city. I just smiled, a cold, calculated smile that confirmed every single one of his deepest insecurities. I did not say a single word. I let the silence stretch deliberately, allowing him to humiliate himself further, while the country club members watched him unravel like a cheap suit. Infuriated by my silence and driven by sheer, unadulterated panic, Jamal lost the last shred of his self-control. He thought he could still physically intimidate me the way he used to corner me in our old kitchen. He lunged forward aggressively, reaching across the white tablecloth, his hand extending violently to grab my arm and force me to answer him. He never even made contact. Before his fingers could brush the fabric of my emerald sleeve, the security operative on my right moved with terrifying speed. The guard intercepted Jamal's forearm mid-air, twisting it sharply downward with a sickening torque. Jamal let out a sharp cry of agony, dropping to his knees instantly against the hardwood floor, as the brutal pressure threatened to completely snap his wrist in half. The guard leaned in over the table, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Do not touch her!" Jamal let out a pathetic, whimpering sound as my security operative applied just enough downward pressure to force him entirely to the floor. The heavy silence of the Oakmont Country Club dining room was broken only by the sharp intake of breath from the surrounding wealthy patrons. Jamal was practically kneeling at my feet, his face pressed near the expensive Italian leather of my shoes. The security guard did not raise his voice, but the lethal warning hung in the air like a physical threat. Valerie did not rush to Jamal's aid. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. She looked down at the man she had destroyed my marriage for, and her expression was filled with absolute, unfiltered revulsion. He was no longer her brilliant new cyber executive. He was a humiliated, broke liability groveling on the floor of her exclusive club. Valerie turned on her heel and power walked out of the dining room, abandoning him completely to rush back to her collapsing empire. I signaled my detail with a slight nod. The guard released Jamal's wrist, letting his arm drop limply to his side. I turned and walked out of the club through the main entrance, flanked by my security team, stepping into the brilliant afternoon sun and slipping into the back of my waiting armored SUV. The sheer contrast between my effortless departure and their catastrophic public breakdown was a masterpiece of poetic justice. The fallout from that afternoon was instantaneous and absolute. By the time my driver navigated through the heavy wrought iron gates of my private estate, the financial reality of Jamal's existence had completely caved in. During our marriage, Jamal had constantly belittled my military service and complained that my veteran disability checks were nothing more than a pathetic government handout. He proudly paraded around our suburban home, claiming he was the sole provider because his name was on the primary deed. What his massive, fragile ego never allowed him to comprehend was the basic mathematics of our household. My reliable federal VA deposits automatically covered the mortgage, the property taxes, and the utility bills every single month without fail. His mediocre mid-level corporate salary was entirely squandered on leasing expensive sports cars, buying designer watches, and funding Brenda's constant demands for luxury dinners. The very second I packed my bags and walked out of that house, I immediately logged into my federal portals and legally rerouted every single cent of my veteran benefits to a newly established private trust. Jamal had been so completely intoxicated by his new affair with Valerie and his sudden promotion to an unearned executive lifestyle that he never even bothered to check his own personal bank accounts. He blindly assumed the mortgage would magically pay itself just like it always had. He was operating under the delusion that his new corporate platinum card would solve any minor inconveniences. But Valerie's company was currently imploding under the weight of a massive Department of Defense cyber lockout. Her corporate finance director had ruthlessly frozen every single executive account to preserve emergency operating capital before the federal auditors arrived. Jamal had absolutely zero access to Valerie's money. His personal savings were entirely non-existent. He had completely missed the first mortgage payment, then he missed the second. Now the crushing gears of the banking institution were grinding forward without mercy. The bank officially issued a formal notice of default. The heavy certified letter arrived in his mailbox, demanding immediate payment of all arrears, or the property would be seized and auctioned to the highest bidder. I was sitting in my sunroom reviewing the architectural blueprints for a massive commercial property acquisition when my secure terminal flagged an incoming call. It was routed through a local number I had not yet permanently blocked. I pressed the flashing green icon on my screen, letting the audio connect to the room's premium surround sound speakers. I did not even have to say hello. Brenda's shrill, panicked voice instantly blasted through the acoustic paneling. She was not using her usual arrogant, condescending tone. She was practically hyperventilating, screaming into the receiver with pure, unadulterated terror. She demanded to know why the bank had just served her son with foreclosure papers. She shrieked that the mortgage was in severe default, and Jamal was currently sitting on the floor of the living room having a massive panic attack because all of his credit cards were declining. Brenda frantically ordered me to log into the banking portal and pay the balance immediately. She had the sheer, breathtaking audacity to try and manipulate me, using the exact same toxic guilt she had wielded for a decade. She yelled that I was legally obligated to maintain the household, regardless of our marital status, because family takes care of family. She insisted that I owed her son this basic level of respect after everything he had done for me. She told me to stop holding a petty grudge over a simple misunderstanding with Valerie and to do my duty as a wife to protect his financial standing. I listened to her desperate, pathetic rambling as I slowly ran my finger over the edge of my mahogany desk. She was demanding that the woman she had viciously discarded step in and save them from the streets. She actually believed she could command me to empty my pockets to save the exact house where they had laughed in my face and told me I was entirely worthless. I let her scream until her voice literally gave out and she was gasping for air. The silence on the line stretched for a long, heavy moment. I leaned closer to the microphone. My voice was completely devoid of any emotion, perfectly even and absolutely cold. I did find a shelter. I bought the building and turned it into a tech incubator. Keep the $20 you offered me. It looks like your husband's accounts are frozen. You told me to take my baggage and get out of his house. It is his problem now. I ended the call. The heavy silence that followed my abrupt click of the end call button was intoxicating. I tossed my cell phone onto the polished mahogany surface of my desk and took a deep, steadying breath. Brenda and Jamal were now trapped in a rapidly collapsing house of cards, suffocating under the very financial pressure they used to weaponize against me. But while Jamal was busy having panic attacks on the floor of his soon-to-be foreclosed living room, his supposedly brilliant fiancée was bleeding out on a much larger, much more public stage. The 72-hour deadline imposed by the Department of Defense was mercilessly ticking down. Valerie had less than 24 hours left before the federal government stripped her firm of every classified contract and initiated a devastating corporate raid. She could not bypass my encryption. Her entire tech department had likely not slept in 3 days, running useless diagnostic tests and hitting the same impenetrable cryptographic wall I had meticulously designed. Desperation breeds recklessness, and Valerie was backed into a corner with a loaded gun to her head. If she could not hack the system, her only remaining option was to buy it outright. By mid-morning, my encrypted terminal lit up with a barrage of alerts from financial news outlets. Valerie had authorized a massive, highly publicized press release. Her defense contracting firm formally announced an aggressive intent to acquire the anonymous holding company that legally owned the Aegis core architecture. The initial buyout offer was staggering, $50 million. She was throwing an absolutely absurd amount of liquid capital at the problem, attempting to smother her own catastrophic negligence with sheer wealth. She made the offer public to signal to the Pentagon that she was proactively resolving the security breach, desperately trying to project an image of strategic dominance rather than absolute panic. I sat back in my chair and watched the business analysts on the financial networks debate the historic acquisition. They praised the bold move, entirely unaware that the entire corporation was currently held hostage by a single line of code. But the most pathetic display of the morning did not come from the news anchors. It came from LinkedIn. Despite facing imminent eviction, despite his mother's frantic screaming, and despite being physically barred from the executive boardroom, Jamal was still desperately clinging to his fragile manufactured image. My security software automatically flagged his public activity. I opened his profile and read his latest post. It was a masterclass in profound delusion. He had uploaded a professional headshot of himself standing in Valerie's glass-walled lobby, wearing a designer suit he could no longer afford. The caption was a lengthy, arrogant essay about corporate resilience and visionary leadership. He proudly announced to his network that he, in his capacity as the newly appointed Vice President of Cyber Operations, was thrilled to be facilitating a historic $50 million tech acquisition. He claimed he was aggressively expanding the firm's digital infrastructure and thanked his brilliant partner Valerie for trusting his strategic direction. He was actively lying to his professional network, puffing out his chest, and taking credit for a desperation buyout that was literally only happening because he had almost bankrupted the company. He was seeking validation in the comment section from his old college fraternity brothers desperately trying to save face in the business community while his actual reality burned to the ground. I closed the browser tab feeling nothing but cold clinical amusement. The sheer audacity of his post only confirmed exactly why I had left him behind. I turned my attention away from the digital circus and focused on the physical reality of my home office. Sitting across from me at my sprawling oak desk was Marcus, my lead intellectual property attorney. Marcus was a ruthless, brilliant legal mind who operated exclusively in the shadows of high-stakes corporate warfare. He did not ask questions about my personal life. He only executed my precise directives. He opened his premium leather briefcase and withdrew a thick stack of heavy watermarked documents. It was the formal legally binding acquisition contract sent directly from Valerie's panicked legal team to my anonymous LLC. Marcus adjusted his glasses and ran his pen down the front page. He explained the terms with mechanical precision. Valerie's lawyers were offering $50 million in a direct cash transfer, completely bypassing any stock options or deferred payouts. They wanted the transaction finalized instantly. But the contract was loaded with aggressive stipulations. They demanded a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, legally binding the creator of Aegis Core to step into the shadows and never publicly claim ownership of the software. They wanted to bury my existence entirely, paying me off to save Valerie's pride and preserve her lucrative federal contracts. They assumed that whoever was sitting on the other side of this screen was simply a greedy developer who would immediately fold at the sight of an 8-figure payout. They assumed money was my ultimate motivation. They were completely, fundamentally wrong. I did not need her $50 million. The royalties I generated from other global contracts already surpassed that figure, safely accumulating in diversified, untouchable offshore accounts. I did not need to sign away my life's work to save the woman who had proudly paraded her affair with my husband. I reached out and picked up my mug of premium dark roast coffee. The ceramic was warm against my palm. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the rich flavor coat my tongue as I looked at the desperate contract sitting on my desk. Marcus watched me silently, waiting for the directive. I set the mug down and met his eyes with absolute, unbreakable resolve. I instructed him to reply to Valerie's entire elite legal team, copying the Department of Defense liaison explicitly named in the acquisition paperwork. I did not want a counteroffer. I did not want a negotiation. I told Marcus to issue a one-word official response: declined. The single word transmitted from Marcus's encrypted server hit Valerie's executive network like a digital execution order. I did not need to be inside her corporate headquarters to know the exact sequence of the fallout, because desperation leaves a very distinct, predictable trail. Within 45 minutes of receiving my refusal, her board of directors forced an emergency closed-door session. The financial bleeding had become impossible to conceal. Inside the glass-walled boardroom, the atmosphere was completely lethal. 7 seasoned venture capitalists and former military generals sat around the massive conference table, staring Valerie down with absolute contempt. They had authorized the $50 million buyout as a final desperate measure to save their Pentagon contracts. Now they demanded to know why the anonymous architect behind the Aegis Corps had summarily rejected an 8-figure cash offer without a single counter-proposal. Valerie tried to project her usual arrogant dominance, pacing at the head of the table and claiming it was merely a temporary negotiation tactic. The board chairman, a retired Marine general with zero tolerance for corporate spin, immediately cut her off. He demanded that the vice president of cyber operations be brought into the room to explain the technical contingencies and outline exactly how they were going to bypass the encryption manually. Valerie turned pale. She had no choice but to summon Jamal. He walked into the hostile boardroom wearing his tailored Italian suit and a confident smirk, entirely unaware that he was walking into an ambush. He stood at the front of the room, expecting to deliver his usual vague buzzwords about synergy and digital expansion. The chairman did not let him speak. He demanded a direct line-by-line technical breakdown of the cryptographic hashing preventing their server access. Jamal froze, the color completely drained from his face. He stammered heavily, sweating through his expensive silk collar. He tried to pivot the conversation to leadership paradigms and proactive market solutions. The board watched him unravel in real time. The brilliant cyber executive Valerie had promised them could not even define basic network security protocols. The realization washed over the room like ice water. The board members looked from the stuttering, panicked man at the front of the room to Valerie. They realized instantly that Jamal was a completely incompetent nepotism hire. He was a disastrous liability she had brought into the company to satisfy her own personal vanity. The chairman slammed his fist onto the table and delivered a merciless ultimatum. Valerie had 24 hours to fix the Aegis Corps lockout, or she would be officially stripped of her title and ousted as chief executive officer for gross negligence. The sheer suffocating pressure of that boardroom mutiny bled directly into the evening. It was the night of the annual Defense Innovations Gala held at the spectacular Grand Atrium. In my past life, Jamal would have mocked me for even looking at photographs of such an exclusive high society event. Tonight I was attending as a platinum sponsor. My newly established wealth management firm had secured me top-tier VIP status, granting me access to the private wraparound balcony that overlooked the entire ballroom. I wore a backless midnight blue silk gown, standing quietly in the shadows with a crystal flute of sparkling water. Elite security operatives flanked the perimeter, ensuring I remained completely undisturbed. Down below, the absolute elite of the military-industrial complex mingled under cascading crystal chandeliers. I leaned against the velvet railing and located Valerie instantly. She was a complete wreck. Her usual immaculate presentation was rapidly deteriorating. She was frantically darting across the marble floor, desperately trying to corner generals and defense senators, trying to secure verbal extensions on her failing contracts. She was begging for grace from the exact same military officials who had already been quietly briefed by their technical advisors that her company was a dead end. Jamal was completely oblivious to the radioactive danger of the situation. He was loitering near the center of the room by the open bar, holding a martini and acting like a corporate kingmaker. He was loudly bragging to a group of junior defense executives, trying to save face in the industry. I could see him puffing out his chest, laughing arrogantly and boasting about the historic $50 million acquisition his company was allegedly about to close. He was actively lying to his professional network, seeking validation from strangers, while his actual reality burned to the ground. He was so addicted to the illusion of power that he could not see his own destruction marching right toward him. Valerie spotted him from across the ballroom. The stress of the boardroom mutiny, the brutal rejection of the buyout, and the impending loss of her entire corporate empire finally boiled over. She stormed across the floor, her eyes locked onto Jamal with a look of pure, unhinged fury. I watched with intense clinical satisfaction as the distance between them closed. Jamal saw her approaching and smiled. He raised his martini glass, attempting to offer some arrogant public toast to his brilliant fiancée. Valerie did not hesitate. Before he could utter a single word, she swung her arm with vicious force and violently slapped the cocktail glass straight out of his hand. The heavy crystal shattered loudly against the pristine marble floor, sending a spray of alcohol and shattered ice across his expensive shoes. The sharp cracking sound echoed over the classical music, causing the surrounding crowd to go completely dead silent. Valerie stepped into his personal space, her face contorted with rage. She screamed at him, her voice carrying across the opulent room. She called him a pathetic, useless parasite. She shrieked that he was entirely worthless and incompetent liability who had absolutely destroyed her life and her company. Jamal stood completely frozen, the sticky liquor dripping down his pant leg. Every single high-level executive he had just tried to impress was now staring at him in abject pity and shock. He looked around the silent ballroom, his mouth opening and closing without any sound. The illusion was gone. His fragile, carefully constructed ego completely and irreversibly shattered right there on the marble floor. The sharp echo of shattering crystals still rang in Jamal's ears as he fled the grand atrium. He stumbled out into the cool night air, leaving behind the whispers and the humiliating stares of the defense industry elite. The sticky mixture of vermouth and shattered ice dried against his expensive Italian trousers with every frantic step he took toward his car. Valerie had publicly, completely eviscerated him. She had stripped away his manufactured executive persona and exposed him as a fraud in front of the exact people he desperately needed to impress. His fragile masculinity could not process the magnitude of the rejection. In his twisted, desperate mind, there was only one way to reclaim his power and save his meal ticket. He had to prove he was the cyber genius he had claimed to be. He had to fix the lockout himself. Jamal drove recklessly through the city, running red lights until he reached the deserted corporate headquarters of Valerie's defense contracting firm. He bypassed the confused night security guard and took the private elevator straight to the executive tech floor. The massive server room was bathed in the harsh white glow of fluorescent lights. He threw off his ruined suit jacket and dropped heavily into the master control chair. His hands were shaking with pure adrenaline and humiliated rage. He pulled up the master command interface and stared at the cryptographic wall of the Aegis core architecture that had completely paralyzed the company. He cracked his knuckles and began to type. He was entirely convinced that sheer aggressive force could bypass a sophisticated military-grade firewall. Jamal did not possess the elegant strategic mind required for modern cyber warfare. He was relying on outdated, clumsy coding scripts and brute force dictionary attacks he had memorized from a basic introductory certification course nearly a decade ago. He started stringing together archaic SQL injections and sloppy backdoor overrides, typing with frantic, heavy keystrokes. He thought he was executing a brilliant tactical maneuver to circumvent the Department of Defense requirement and manually restore Valerie's federal contracts. Miles away, I sat in the absolute quiet of my private home office, perfectly cradled in my ergonomic leather chair. The room was dark, illuminated only by the cool blue light radiating from my wall of secure curved monitors. I took a slow sip of my freshly brewed dark roast coffee as a distinct, high-pitched chime broke the silence. A secondary screen flickered to life, displaying a real-time intrusion log originating directly from Valerie's corporate IP address. I set my coffee mug down on the mahogany desk and leaned forward, resting my elbows on the smooth surface. I watched the lines of code scrolling rapidly across my screen, and a cold, genuine smile spread across my face. I recognized the pathetic, archaic syntax instantly. Years ago, when we were still married, Jamal used to stand behind my desk in our cramped suburban kitchen, watching me compile highly classified defense architectures for the military. He used to laugh at my complex methodical algorithms, waving his beer, and telling me that my rigorous military standards were a waste of time. He constantly belittled my active duty service, calling my cryptographic engineering nothing more than glorified IT support. He genuinely believed that real coding was about aggressive shortcuts and brute force hacking. What his supreme arrogance never allowed him to realize was that I had specifically designed the federal tripwires within the Aegis Core framework to trap reckless, sloppy operators exactly like him. On my monitor, I watched Jamal push harder against the outer perimeter of the firewall. He encountered a secondary encryption layer and immediately attempted to deploy an illegal masking protocol to hide his digital footprint. It was a chaotic amateur move. He was sweating in that empty server room, convinced he was steadily breaking through the military-grade defenses. He did not realize that my system was not failing. It was actively making a deliberate calculation. The Aegis Core was an adaptive intelligence framework. It was designed to recognize a hostile brute force attack and seamlessly open a false digital corridor, letting the intruder step directly into an inescapable honeypot. I watched his keystrokes log in real time. He bypassed the false perimeter and his typing speed increased. I could practically picture the arrogant smirk returning to his face. He thought he had won. He thought he had just outsmarted the anonymous architect and saved Valerie's multi-million-dollar empire. He compiled his final payload, a crude, invasive script designed to forcefully rewrite the defense contractor permissions and bypass the Pentagon authorization mandate. He did not understand that he was not bypassing the security protocols. He was actively kicking down the front door of a highly classified federal server. I sat perfectly still, my eyes locked onto the primary monitor as he finalized the command string. He executed the payload and hit enter. The absolute finality of his mistake was instantaneous. The Aegis Core framework did not just reject his unauthorized code, it immediately isolated his specific terminal, locked down his geographic location, and captured his entire digital identity. My secure screens instantly shifted from cool blue to a violent, flashing crimson. The system formally identified a critical Level 1 unauthorized breach attempt on a classified military server originating directly from the executive floor of Valerie's firm. Jamal's crude, desperate attempt to prove his manhood had just bypassed a corporate dispute and crossed the line into federal cyber terrorism. The automated protocols executed flawlessly. As I watched the red lights pulse across my office walls, Jamal's clumsy keystrokes triggered a massive automatic federal alarm directly at the Pentagon. The flashing crimson light illuminating my home office was merely the digital prelude to the physical storm that erupted across the city. Within exactly 12 minutes of Jamal executing his catastrophic hacking script, a fleet of black tactical SUVs swarmed the glass plaza of Valerie's corporate headquarters. Armed federal agents from the Department of Defense Cyber Division breached the executive floor, seizing every server terminal and physical document in the building. Jamal had not just violated a corporate non-disclosure agreement. He had committed an act of federal cyber terrorism by attempting to inject an unauthorized payload directly into a defense infrastructure pipeline. He was dragged out of the server room in handcuffs, his face completely drained of color, babbling incoherent excuses to stern-faced federal investigators who did not care about his fragile ego. The federal lockdown of Valerie's empire sent an immediate, devastating shockwave through her entire supply chain. The government froze every single asset linked to her firm, pending a massive national security investigation. This absolute financial paralysis instantly cascaded down to the subcontractors who relied entirely on Valerie's defense money. That was where the hammer struck Chloe and her husband Terrence. Terrence ran a boutique logistics consultancy that had secured extremely lucrative shipping contracts by exploiting Chloe's close proximity to Valerie. They had built their entire arrogant lifestyle on the assumption that Valerie's money would flow forever. Just the week prior, Terrence had financed a customized luxury yacht, and Chloe had signed a lease on a summer home in the Hamptons. They believed they were untouchable, firmly elevated into the upper echelons of society. But when the Pentagon locked down Valerie's accounts, Terrence's firm was flagged as a primary financial dependent. Federal auditors froze his corporate and personal assets simultaneously to prevent any potential laundering of defense funds. The evaporation of their wealth was swift and ruthless. Chloe went to purchase her usual $600 morning spa package, and her platinum cards were declined in front of the entire waiting room. She called Terrence in a panic, only to discover him hyperventilating in his office as federal agents boxed up his computers. The bank automatically flagged their yacht for repossession. The luxury cars were scheduled for immediate towing. They were bleeding dry by the second, their entire manufactured existence collapsing into ash. Chloe was fundamentally a parasite. She possessed no real loyalty to anyone but herself. When she realized that Jamal was facing decades in federal prison and Valerie was about to be indicted for gross negligence, Chloe did not offer support. She immediately began searching for a lifeboat. She knew that Valerie kept a private encrypted hard drive at her secondary penthouse, a property Chloe had access to for arranging private catering events. Driven by sheer opportunistic desperation, Chloe bypassed the doorman, entered the penthouse before the federal raid teams arrived and looted the safe. She stole the primary flash drive containing Valerie's offshore account numbers, illegal wire transfers, and hidden embezzlement ledgers. Chloe believed this stolen drive was her golden ticket. She assumed she could leverage the damning information to secure her own survival. She used the last few $100s of her hidden cash reserves to hire a private investigator desperately tracking the heavily shielded ownership records of the anonymous LLC that owned the Aegis Corps. When the investigator finally managed to trace the corporate shell companies back to my private estate, Chloe did not hesitate. I was standing in the grand foyer of my new home, admiring the vaulted ceilings and the sweeping marble staircase when my head of security tapped his earpiece. He informed me that a frantic woman matching my sister-in-law's description was violently rattling the front security gate and begging to speak with the owner. She had bypassed the outer perimeter call box and marched directly up the private access road. I instructed my security team to hold their positions. I walked out of the heavy oak front doors and made my way down the long manicured driveway. The property was a fortress surrounded by towering stone walls and heavy wrought iron gates designed to keep the chaos of the world entirely at bay. Chloe stood on the other side of the iron bars, gripping the cold metal with shaking hands. The transformation was staggering. She was no longer the smug, perfectly groomed woman wrapped in designer winter wear who had mocked me in the snow. Her hair was completely disheveled, flying wildly in the afternoon wind. Her expensive mascara was smudged beneath her frantic, bloodshot eyes. She looked absolutely terrified, a woman who was actively drowning and thrashing wildly for a life preserver. When she saw me walking down the driveway wrapped in a tailored cashmere coat, her jaw dropped. The sheer impossibility of the situation temporarily robbed her of speech. She had expected to negotiate with a ruthless corporate entity. Instead, she was staring directly at the woman she had viciously discarded and laughed at. She gripped the iron bars tighter, her knuckles turning white, as she struggled to comprehend that I was the anonymous architect who had systematically dismantled their entire universe. She did not offer an apology. Chloe was entirely incapable of genuine remorse. Instead, she immediately launched into a pathetic, desperate sales pitch. She pressed her face against the iron bars and started speaking in a rapid, frantic rush. She told me that Terrence was completely ruined and the banks were coming to seize their condo. She tried to frame herself as a victim, claiming she had always known Jamal and Brenda were treating me terribly and insisting she had secretly been on my side the entire time. It was a sickening display of complete moral bankruptcy. She reached into her designer coat and pulled out the silver flash drive. She shoved her hand through the gap in the iron bars, holding the drive out to me like a desperate offering. She promised that the drive contained everything needed to bury Valerie permanently. She offered to hand over all of the stolen internal financial documents outlining the exact offshore accounts and embezzlement trails the Pentagon had not yet discovered. In exchange, she begged for a position at my firm. She pleaded for a consulting fee, a paycheck, a cash advance, anything to save her from the financial ruin crashing down on her head. She was actively selling out the very people she had worshipped just days prior, simply to save her own skin. I stood perfectly still on my side of the gate, listening to the frantic edge of panic in her voice. I looked at the flash drive trembling in her outstretched hand. I remembered the freezing night I was thrown out into the snow with absolutely nothing. I remembered the exact expression of supreme arrogance on Chloe's face, as she had dug into her purse, treating my devastation as an entertaining joke. I stepped forward and calmly plucked the silver flash drive from her trembling fingers. Chloe let out a sharp breath of relief, her shoulders dropping as she mistakenly believed I had accepted her pathetic bargain. She opened her mouth to ask about her starting salary. I did not let her speak. I reached into the deep pocket of my cashmere coat. I had kept the exact item she had given me on that freezing night, deliberately preserving it as a reminder of their cruelty. I pulled out the heavily crumpled $20 bill. I looked directly into Chloe's desperate, terrified eyes and pressed the wrinkled paper currency through the iron bars, forcing it into her palm. For an Uber. I turned my back on her and signaled the security control room. The heavy iron gates immediately engaged with a deep metallic hum, locking firmly into place and shutting her out completely. The heavy iron gate locked with a resounding metallic thud, sealing Chloe outside in the freezing wind with nothing but a crumpled $20 bill. I did not look back. I walked the long, winding path up to my estate, the silver flash drive resting heavy and cold in my palm. The sheer desperation that drove Chloe to betray her former idol was a testament to the absolute collapse of Valerie's empire. But I knew that whatever secrets Valerie considered important enough to hide on an encrypted offline drive would be the final nails in the coffin. I entered the warm, quiet sanctuary of my home, bypassed the main living areas, and went straight to my secure office. I booted up an isolated, air-gapped terminal specifically designed to handle volatile or infected data. I inserted the drive. Valerie had paid for commercial-grade encryption utilizing a standard AES algorithm that would have kept out a curious assistant or a lazy corporate auditor. For the architect of the Aegis core, it was the digital equivalent of a chain-link fence. I ran a targeted decryption sequence, watching the progress bar tear through her security protocols in less than 3 minutes. The drive unmounted and remounted instantly, spilling a massive hidden directory across my curved monitors. I began sorting through the raw data, expecting to find standard corporate malfeasance. What I uncovered was a masterpiece of sociopathic manipulation. The first folder contained meticulously hidden financial ledgers that painted a horrifying picture. Valerie had not just mismanaged her defense contracting firm. She had been actively bleeding it dry for over 14 months. Long before she ever met Jamal, she had been siphoning millions of dollars in federal defense funds directly into untraceable shell companies located in Cyprus and the Cayman Islands. She had created ghost contractors, billed the Pentagon for phantom logistics, and funneled the cash straight into her personal offshore accounts. But the federal government is relentless, and the audit trail was catching up to her. Valerie knew the Department of Defense was preparing a comprehensive financial review. She knew she was going to be caught. She desperately needed a scapegoat. She needed someone arrogant enough to demand a high-level title, but incompetent enough never to look at the actual network architecture. She needed a patsy who would blindly sign fiduciary liability waivers simply because he was blinded by the prestige of the corner office. She needed Jamal. I opened the legal directory and found the unredacted employment contracts Jamal had signed when he accepted the position of Vice President of Cyber Operations. Reading through the clauses was like watching a man walk willingly into a wood chipper. Valerie had structured his entire executive contract to make him the sole legal authorizing figure for the exact offshore data nodes where she was hiding the stolen money. By accepting the promotion, Jamal had legally claimed ownership of the compromised servers. Valerie had orchestrated his hiring purely to frame him for her own federal crimes. But the financial setup was only half of the trap. Jamal was a narcissist, and narcissists are famously unreliable. Valerie needed absolute certainty that he would not panic and quit the moment the federal auditors arrived. She needed to lock him down, bound to her by something deeper than a corporate title. I clicked into a folder marked with a string of randomized numbers. It contained personal medical records and private billing invoices. I read through the documents, my blood running completely cold. There were no ultrasound bills. There were no prenatal care schedules. Instead, I found heavily redacted invoices from an elite private concierge clinic charging exorbitant fees for black market hormone injections designed to simulate the physical symptoms of early pregnancy. Beside those were digital receipts for a high-end theatrical prosthetic belly and emails arranging the purchase of falsified ultrasound images. I opened her personal medical profile and read the undeniable clinical truth. Valerie was completely barren. She was never pregnant. The entire narrative of their passionate, scandalous love child was a calculated, sterile fiction. She had manufactured a pregnancy specifically to trap Jamal. She knew his ego would force him to do the honorable thing and leave his wife if he believed he was starting a new legacy with a powerful CEO. The fake pregnancy was the ultimate chain designed to ensure he moved into her penthouse, signed those lethal corporate documents, and tethered himself directly to the anchor of her sinking ship. I sat back in my leather chair, the blue light of the monitors reflecting off my face. The sheer scale of the betrayal was almost difficult to process. Jamal had thrown away a decade of marriage, a loyal partner, and a stable home because he believed he was leveling up. He believed he had conquered the corporate world and secured a beautiful pregnant heiress who worshipped his intellect. Right at this very moment, he was sitting in a federal holding cell under the harsh fluorescent lights of an interrogation room. He was likely terrified, but clinging to the belief that his brilliant, powerful fiancée was calling her elite team of lawyers to bail him out. He probably thought they were a team facing a temporary misunderstanding over a minor security breach. He was entirely unaware that the woman he destroyed our family for had never loved him, never carried his child, and had meticulously engineered his path straight into a federal penitentiary. He was nothing but a human shield, and he had walked into the trap with a proud, arrogant smile on his face. The federal agents did not keep him in the holding cell for long. They did not need to. They already possessed his digital signature on the unauthorized server breach and his physical signature on Valerie's offshore holding accounts. They simply interrogated him for 6 grueling hours, stripped him of his passport, and released him onto the freezing pavement pending a formal grand jury indictment. His corporate credit cards were frozen. His personal bank accounts were locked under a federal warrant. Valerie's elite legal team had already issued a ruthless midnight press release officially terminating his employment and branding him a rogue operative who had acted entirely alone. He was completely radioactive. It was nearly 3 in the morning when my secure private line vibrated on the mahogany nightstand. Only a handful of highly vetted individuals possessed that number. Jamal was certainly not one of them. He had likely begged, bribed, or emotionally manipulated someone from our old social circle to track it down. I picked up the glowing device and accepted the call without saying a single word. The sound of heavy, frantic breathing filled the speaker. Jamal was actively hyperventilating. The supreme arrogance that had defined his entire existence was completely eradicated, replaced by the pathetic, gasping sobs of a man who had just watched his entire universe vaporize. He did not bother with an introduction. He just started weeping. He told me he was standing at a payphone outside a cheap motel because the concierge at Valerie's luxury penthouse had threatened to call the police when he tried to enter the lobby. He was shivering, his voice cracking as he frantically tried to explain the nightmare he had just endured. He sobbed that Valerie was completely insane, a cold and calculating monster who had entirely set him up. The federal investigators had slammed stacks of corporate documents down on the interrogation table, showing him the fiduciary liability waivers he had eagerly signed without reading. He realized with absolute horrifying clarity that Valerie had never viewed him as an equal partner. She had viewed him as a disposable human shield. He wept that she was not returning his calls, that her security team had thrown his few remaining possessions onto the sidewalk in garbage bags. He was rapidly bleeding out in the dark, absolutely desperate for a lifeline. I did not offer him a single syllable of comfort. I simply held the phone slightly away from my ear, letting his pathetic breakdown echo softly into the quiet room. I was sitting in the center of the newly finished custom nursery in my gated estate. The room was a masterpiece of serene design, bathed in the soft, warm glow of a crystal nightlight. Thick plush carpets lined the floor, and the air smelled faintly of lavender and fresh linen. I sat in a velvet glider, gently rocking Maya to sleep against my chest. Her steady, peaceful breathing was a stark, beautiful contrast to the chaotic, destructive panic radiating from the phone in my hand. Across the room, her twin brother slept soundly in his bespoke crib, completely shielded from the pathetic man weeping on the other end of the line. Jamal's tears escalated into a desperate, groveling plea. He realized his complaints about Valerie were not drawing any sympathy from me, so he immediately pivoted to his ultimate manipulation tactic. He invoked the children. He choked on his own tears, claiming that he had been blinded by corporate greed and manipulation. He swore that sitting in that federal holding cell had forced him to realize what truly mattered in life. He begged to come home. He pleaded with me to tell him where I was living, swearing that he would do whatever it took to earn back my trust. He said he just wanted to be a father again. He begged to see the twins. He cried out Maya's name, claiming his heart was broken, and that he needed to hold his children to remind himself that he was still a good man. He spun a frantic, delusional narrative where I would simply open my doors, forgive his monstrous betrayals, and let him hide in the safety of the family he had so callously discarded. He was still operating under the delusion that I was the same quiet, compliant woman he had left behind. He actually believed his tears could break my resolve. I looked down at Maya's perfect sleeping face. I gently brushed a soft curl away from her forehead, feeling an overwhelming surge of protective power. I had built an impenetrable fortress for my children, an empire funded by my own brilliance, and I was never going to let his toxic, chaotic failure infect our lives ever again. I stopped rocking the glider. Jamal was still babbling, promising that he would change, promising that we could start over, begging for just one chance to see the twins and prove that he was not the colossal failure the federal government was accusing him of being. I cut off his tears with a voice entirely devoid of emotion. It was cold, clinical, and absolutely final. I'll let you see exactly what you gave up, Jamal. Turn on CNN tomorrow morning at exactly 8 a.m. I disconnected the call, turned off the phone, and tossed it onto the plush carpet. I went back to gently rocking my daughter, enjoying the absolute unbroken silence of my home. The morning sun streamed through the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows of my private home office, but my attention was entirely locked on the high-resolution tablet resting against my coffee mug. Chloe had believed she was handing me a simple flash drive full of financial ledgers to buy her own salvation. She had absolutely no idea that the drive also contained the administrative master keys to Valerie's heavily guarded smart home surveillance network. Valerie was a woman defined by severe paranoia and an obsessive need for control. She had installed hidden high-definition cameras and audio receivers in every single room of her own luxury penthouse, deliberately designed to spy on her executives, her staff, and her lovers. Rerouting her master access privileges to my own encrypted server had taken me less than 10 minutes. Now I possessed a front-row digital seat to the absolute collapse of my enemies. It was 7:55 in the morning. The live feed from Valerie's main living area showed a space that had descended into total catastrophic ruin. The once pristine, minimalist penthouse overlooking the city skyline was currently littered with half-packed cardboard boxes, overturned designer chairs, and federal legal documents scattered carelessly across the imported silk rugs. Bright yellow federal seizure notices were taped to the front double doors, serving as a glaring reminder that the property was in active foreclosure and scheduled for government auction. Valerie paced frantically near the massive flat-screen television, clutching a crystal glass filled with straight vodka despite the early hour. Her expensive designer clothes were violently rumpled, and her hair was unwashed. The polished, untouchable corporate CEO she had pretended to be was completely gone, replaced by a manic, cornered animal. She was screaming at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with sheer hysteria, as she hurled a heavy coffee table book across the room. Jamal sat slumped on the edge of a velvet sofa, directly in her line of fire, staring blankly at the floor. He looked like a hollow, discarded shell of the arrogant man who had walked out on our family. He was still wearing the exact same wrinkled suit he had worn in the federal holding cell. His face was unshaven, his eyes bloodshot and swollen from crying. He was shivering slightly, clearly running on a toxic mixture of absolute terror and extreme sleep deprivation. His mother, Brenda, sat stiffly in a wingback chair, clutching her ridiculous counterfeit designer purse defensively against her chest. She had clearly rushed over in the middle of the night to comfort her golden boy, only to realize with mounting horror that she was standing on a rapidly sinking ship. Even Chloe was present, hovering nervously near the kitchen island, like a parasite unsure of where to attach itself. She had somehow managed to slither back into Valerie's penthouse, hoping to scavenge whatever scraps were left, after I had locked her out in the freezing cold. "You useless, pathetic idiot," Valerie shrieked, pointing a trembling finger directly at Jamal. "You were supposed to manage the audit. You were supposed to take the compliance charges. My lawyers cannot even get the federal prosecutors on the phone because of your monumental incompetence. They are freezing everything. They are taking my company." Jamal flinched, covering his face with his hands. "Stop yelling," he pleaded, his voice weak and raspy. "She told me to turn on the television. She promised me. She said to watch the news at 8 o'clock. She has a plan to fix this." Brenda puffed up her chest, attempting to summon her usual misplaced arrogance. "Your ex-wife is a boring housewife, Jamal. She does not have the power to stop a federal indictment. You need to call your uncle in Chicago and borrow money for a real defense attorney. This woman has ruined you," Brenda spat, glaring viciously at Valerie. Valerie let out a sharp, hysterical bark of laughter. "I ruined him. Your son is a walking liability who signed federal liability waivers without reading a single page because he wanted a fancy title on his business cards. We are all going to federal prison because he is an absolute moron." Chloe remained perfectly silent, her eyes darting nervously toward the television screen. She knew exactly what I was capable of, and she was the only one in the room who understood that whatever was about to happen was not going to be a rescue mission. Jamal checked his watch, his hands visibly shaking. "It is time," he muttered, grabbing the remote control from the coffee table. He turned on the massive television and switched the input to CNN. He was leaning forward on the sofa, practically holding his breath, clinging to the pathetic delusional hope that my warning meant I had somehow intervened with the Department of Defense to save his miserable life. He actually believed I still loved him enough to pull him out of the wreckage. The digital clock on the bottom of the news broadcast ticked over to 8 o'clock exactly. The CNN anchor appeared on the screen, her expression serious and strictly professional. The breaking news banner flashed in bold red letters across the bottom third of the television, completely dominating the screen. I tapped the volume icon on my tablet, listening perfectly as the anchor's crisp voice echoed through Valerie's ruined living room. "Good morning," the anchor began, looking directly into the camera. "We begin this hour with breaking news out of Washington. The Department of Defense has officially concluded its emergency security review following a massive catastrophic data breach at Aegis Defense Contracting. The federal government announced this morning that it is permanently terminating all existing military contracts, with the firm citing gross negligence, severe infrastructure vulnerabilities, and overwhelming evidence of corporate financial fraud." Valerie let out a strangled gasp, dropping her crystal glass. It shattered violently against the hardwood floor, spraying vodka and shards of glass across the room. Her knees buckled and she collapsed into a nearby dining chair, burying her face in her hands. The firm she had built on a foundation of lies was officially dead, but the broadcast was not finished. To prevent a critical vulnerability in our national security grid, the anchor continued reading from the teleprompter, the Pentagon has executed an unprecedented emergency executive order. The Department of Defense has bypassed the standard bidding process and awarded a $500 million exclusive cybersecurity contract to the private firm that successfully intercepted and neutralized the breach. Jamal slowly lowered the remote control, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and desperate confusion. He leaned closer to the screen, waiting to hear the name of the corporate savior he believed was going to somehow absorb their debt and keep him out of federal prison. The anchor paused for a fraction of a second before delivering the final devastating blow. The $500 million exclusive federal contract has been awarded to Aegis Corps, a premier shadow cybersecurity firm. The Pentagon has also released a statement praising the firm's founder and chief architect for her unparalleled service to national security. The news graphic completely shifted. The CNN logo transitioned into a massive, high-resolution professional portrait that filled the entire television screen. It was my face. I was wearing a tailored charcoal suit, looking directly into the camera with an expression of calm, absolute authority. The caption beneath my face read, "Founder and CEO of Aegis Corps." I watched the live feed on my tablet as the air was instantly sucked out of Valerie's penthouse. The silence in the room was absolute and completely deafening. Jamal slowly rose from the velvet sofa, his mouth falling open in a display of pure, unadulterated horror. He stumbled backward as if he had been violently struck in the chest, tripping over a sealed packing box and crashing hard onto the floor. He scrambled back against the wall, unable to look away from the television. He realized in that agonizing, defining second that the woman he had viciously discarded as a boring, unambitious burden had just secured $500 million in federal funding and single-handedly orchestrated the entire destruction of his universe. The static image of my face on the CNN broadcast dissolved into a live high-definition feed. The camera pulled back to reveal the grand press briefing room inside the Pentagon. The official seal of the Department of Defense gleamed imposing and pristine behind a polished mahogany podium. A row of stern-faced military generals and federal cyber command directors stood at attention, waiting for the keynote speaker to take the stage. The tension in the room was palpable, a heavy anticipation of the historic announcement. Then I walked onto the screen. I did not look like the exhausted, neglected wife Jamal had left behind to chase his delusions of grandeur. I did not look like the woman shivering in the snow staring at Chloe's mocking smile. I was wearing a stunning, flawlessly tailored white power suit. It was a deliberate choice, a visual statement of absolute dominance, purity, and rebirth. My posture was straight, my expression serene and commanding. The flashing lights of the press pool illuminated the room as I confidently stepped up to the array of microphones. At the bottom of the television screen, the digital chyron flashed in bold, sharp lettering, leaving absolutely no room for misunderstanding or denial. Kendra Washington, founder and chief executive officer, Aegis Corps. I adjusted the microphone and looked directly into the primary news camera. I knew exactly who was watching on the other side of that lens. I began speaking, my voice steady and resonant, echoing through the television speakers and filling Valerie's ruined penthouse with undeniable authority. I spoke about the critical importance of national security, the absolute necessity of rooting out internal corruption, and the duty of private tech sectors to protect federal infrastructure. Every single word I delivered was perfectly professional for the press corps, but entirely lethal for the specific audience panicking in that penthouse. I detailed exactly how Aegis Corps had detected the massive financial anomalies within the previous defense contractors' network. I explained with clinical precision how we had methodically tracked the embezzlement, traced the hidden offshore accounts through Cyprus and the Cayman Islands, and provided federal authorities with a comprehensive, unassailable roadmap of the corporate fraud. I made it explicitly clear that the previous executives were not just incompetent, but actively malicious. I did not just defeat them in the boardroom. I publicly dissected and exposed their entire criminal enterprise on national television, permanently blacklisting them from ever working in the industry again. I looked down at my encrypted tablet watching the live surveillance feed of the penthouse. The psychological devastation playing out on the screen was absolute perfection. Jamal had somehow managed to pull himself off the floor during the commercial break. He was leaning heavily against the marble kitchen island, gripping a ceramic coffee mug with both hands in a desperate attempt to steady his violent shaking. As my live press conference began and the Chiron confirmed my identity, his hands went completely slack. The heavy mug slipped from his trembling fingers, dropping straight to the hardwood floor. It shattered into a dozen pieces, splashing dark cold coffee across his expensive Italian leather shoes. He did not even blink. He just stared at the television screen, his jaw trembling as the impossible reality crushed the last remaining fragments of his fractured ego. His mind was finally connecting the dots of his total ruin. He had thrown away a billionaire tech visionary to become the legal scapegoat for a fraudulent, bankrupt criminal. The life of luxury and power he thought he was stealing had actually belonged to the wife he had thrown away. Valerie's reaction was far more volatile. The realization that she had been utterly outplayed and dismantled by the woman she had viewed as an insignificant domestic peasant broke her completely. She let out a guttural, piercing scream of pure, unadulterated horror. Her hands tore at her unwashed hair as her carefully constructed reality disintegrated. She grabbed a heavy brass lamp from the side table and hurled it directly at the massive flat-screen television. It missed the screen by inches, smashing into the drywall and leaving a deep, jagged crater. She turned her blinding rage toward Jamal, launching herself at him with her manicured nails bared. She shrieked that this was his fault, that he had brought a Trojan horse into her life, that I must have been using him to spy on her operations. She beat her fists against his chest, but Jamal did not even raise his arms to defend himself. He just stood there completely catatonic, a dead man walking into a federal prison sentence. In the background, Brenda was experiencing a total system failure. For her entire life, she had worshipped wealth and superficial status, blindly defending Jamal's worst atrocities because she believed he was destined for greatness. She had mocked my clothes, my ambitions, and my worth every single chance she got. Now she was staring at her former daughter-in-law standing at a Pentagon podium, commanding a $500 million federal contract, while her precious golden boy faced decades behind bars. The sheer shock overrode her nervous system. She clutched her chest, let out a short, wheezing gasp, and fainted dead away, collapsing backward onto the velvet couch in a heap of cheap counterfeit designer fabric. Amidst the screaming and the shattering debris, nobody even moved to check if she was breathing. Chloe remained plastered against the far wall near the entryway, her eyes darting between the television screen and the violent chaos erupting in the living room. The realization of her own monumental stupidity was washing over her face in real time. She had literally handed me the exact cryptographic master keys I needed to seal their federal indictments. She had broken into Valerie's safe to steal the drive, believing she was securing a golden ticket to leverage her own survival. Instead, she had delivered the final execution order directly into my hands, and I had bought it from her for a crumpled $20 bill to pay for an Uber. She had tried to play both sides and ended up securing her own position at the absolute bottom of the wreckage with zero leverage and zero allies. I sat back in my velvet glider and watched them tear each other apart inside that foreclosing luxury cage. I reached out and gently rubbed Maya's back as she slept peacefully against my chest. Her soft, rhythmic breathing was a stark, beautiful contrast to the screaming and destruction echoing from the tablet. The war was officially over. I had protected my children, reclaimed my power, and executed a flawless total victory. They had not even realized they were fighting until the earth was already being shoveled over their graves. The camera held steady on my face as the press room erupted into a frenzy of flashing bulbs and shouted questions. I stood at the mahogany podium inside the Pentagon, perfectly composed in my tailored white suit. On my encrypted tablet resting just below the microphone, the silent live feed from Valerie's penthouse displayed a scene of absolute, unadulterated devastation. Jamal was still frozen on the floor, his mouth working silently as he stared at the woman he had thrown away, now standing as the architect of his ruin. Valerie was screaming at the television, her perfectly manicured hands tearing at her hair. I raised a single hand, and the press corps instantly fell silent. The power in the room belonged entirely to me. I looked directly into the center camera lens piercing through the broadcast and straight into the living room of the people who had tried to destroy me. "We are proud to secure this nation's defense," I stated, my voice echoing with crisp, uncompromising authority. "National security cannot be entrusted to organizations crippled by gross negligence and internal corruption." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over the room and over the penthouse. Furthermore, I continued, offering a cold, clinical smile. "My company has officially acquired the remaining assets of the previous defense contractor. We purchased their entire infrastructure, their server networks, and their physical properties for pennies on the dollar, effective at 6 o'clock this morning. We now own them completely, and we will be cleaning house." On the tablet screen, Valerie's knees gave out. She collapsed beside the shattered glass of her dropped drink, her hands gripping the edges of the velvet sofa as she realized she no longer owned her own company. Her legacy was erased, bought out from under her by the very woman she had mocked. But financial ruin was not the final destination, it was just the prelude. I stepped slightly to the side of the podium. Just out of frame of the main news cameras stood Special Agent Harris, the lead investigator for the Department of Defense Cyber Division. I reached inside the podium shelf and withdrew a thick, sealed manila folder. I slid it smoothly across the polished wood, directly into Harris's waiting hands. He knew exactly what it was. We had coordinated this moment for the past 24 hours. The folder contained the raw, unencrypted data I had extracted from Chloe's stolen flash drive. It held the irrefutable, hard-coded proof of Valerie's offshore Cayman Island embezzlement ledgers. It also contained the exact digital footprints of Jamal's pathetic, unauthorized attempt to hack into the federal defense grid, utilizing the administrative credentials Valerie had forced him to sign for. I had handed the federal government the murder weapon, the fingerprints, and the signed confession all in one neat package. Harris gave me a curt, respectful nod and immediately tapped his earpiece, signaling the tactical teams already lying in wait. I turned my attention back to the live feed on my tablet. The atmosphere inside the luxury penthouse had shifted from shock to a primal, frantic panic. Jamal was hyperventilating, clutching his chest as if he were having a heart attack. He scrambled toward Brenda, who was just beginning to stir from her fainting spell on the couch. He shook her shoulders, begging her to wake up, screaming that they needed to run. Chloe, recognizing the absolute finality of the situation, did not hesitate. She abandoned her useless pride, abandoned her ruined family, and sprinted for the front door, her designer heels slipping on the hardwood floor. She grabbed the heavy brass handle, desperately trying to yank it open and flee into the hallway before the consequences arrived. She did not make it. Through the live audio feed on my tablet, a deafening metallic boom echoed through the penthouse. Chloe screamed, stumbling backward and falling hard onto the marble entryway. The heavy double doors of the penthouse violently shuddered. Valerie shrieked, crawling backward across the silk rug, desperately trying to hide behind the kitchen island. Jamal froze, his hands raised in the air, his eyes wide with absolute terror. A second massive boom followed. The sound of a heavy tactical battering ram striking reinforced steel. Federal agents opened the door, a booming voice echoed from the hallway, loud enough to be picked up by every hidden microphone in the room. I watched with quiet, profound satisfaction as the front doors splintered and burst open. A dozen heavily armed federal agents in tactical gear flooded into the luxury penthouse, their weapons drawn, shouting commands that completely drowned out Jamal's pathetic, sobbing pleas. The heavy glass doors of Valerie's luxury high-rise slid open smoothly as I stepped into the sprawling marble lobby. Outside, the freezing morning air was fractured by the spinning red and blue lights of half a dozen federal tactical vehicles blocking the street. Inside, the usually serene and pristine lobby had been transformed into a chaotic staging ground for the Department of Defense. Heavily armed agents stood by the elevators, their radios crackling with secure comms. I stood near the center of the room, my white tailored suit a stark contrast to the dark tactical gear swarming the building. I did not have to wait long. The brass elevator doors dinged and slid apart, revealing a scene of absolute humiliating defeat. Federal agents marched Valerie out first. Her hands were secured tightly in heavy steel cuffs behind her back. She was thrashing wildly, screaming threats at the officers about her lawyers and her corporate rights, but her voice was hoarse and entirely powerless. The agents ignored her, practically dragging her toward the spinning lights outside. Then came Jamal. He was practically dead weight between two massive federal agents. His expensive suit was torn at the shoulder, his tie hung loosely around his neck, and his face was a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked completely shattered, a man who had finally realized the catastrophic price of his own blind greed. Behind him, Brenda was wailing. She had not been arrested, but she was entirely collateral damage. She fell to her knees right there on the polished marble floor of the lobby, clutching her counterfeit designer purse, sobbing hysterically as she watched her golden boy being hauled away like a common criminal. The wealthy residents of the building who had gathered to watch the spectacle whispered and pointed, completely stripping Brenda of the artificial high-class status she worshipped so deeply. Out of the corner of my eye, I spotted Chloe. She was pressed flat against a marble pillar near the concierge desk, desperately trying to blend into the shadows and escape the building unnoticed. She looked terrified, clutching her cheap coat around her trembling shoulders. I did not even bother acknowledging her existence. She was a scavenger, and scavengers always scramble back to the gutters when the predators arrive. As the agents hauled Jamal toward the revolving doors, his bloodshot eyes darted frantically around the room and locked onto mine. He stopped dead in his tracks, forcing the agents to yank him forward. His eyes widened in absolute shock. He saw the white power suit. He saw the cold, unbroken authority radiating from my posture. He saw the woman he had thrown away standing as the undisputed conqueror of his entire world. The sheer desperation broke whatever was left of his pride. Jamal dropped violently to his knees right in the middle of the lobby, dragging the two federal agents down with him. "Kendra, please!" he screamed, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. He strained against the steel cuffs, tears streaming down his face as he begged like a cornered animal. Tell them I'm your husband. Please, Kendra, save me. I didn't know what she was doing. Save me." The federal agents paused, looking at me for confirmation. I took a slow, deliberate step forward. The lobby fell dead silent, the only sound the soft click of my heels against the marble. I looked down at him, a pathetic, shivering mess on the floor. I slowly raised my wrist and adjusted the face of my diamond watch, checking the time with absolute clinical indifference. I met his desperate, pleading gaze and delivered the final blow. "My ex-husband," I corrected, my voice ringing clear and cold through the massive room. "And as your mother so elegantly put it, take your baggage and get out." The agents hauled him roughly to his feet, ignoring his fresh round of hysterical sobbing, and dragged him out into the freezing snow. Weeks later, the air inside the federal courthouse felt heavy and stale. I sat quietly in the back row of the gallery, completely unnoticed by the frantic legal teams scrambling at the defense tables. Resting in my lap was a thick, sealed manila envelope. It did not contain corporate espionage or federal indictments. It contained the finalized, judge-ordered sole custody papers for my twins. Jamal's parental rights had been completely and permanently severed. He was no longer a father. He was just a federal inmate number. The sentencing hearing was a bloodbath. Valerie had immediately turned on Jamal the second the feds offered her a plea deal. She threw him entirely under the bus, submitting audio recordings and forged emails to prove that Jamal was the one who authorized the illegal server bypasses and signed the fraudulent financial ledgers. She painted him as a rogue, ambitious executive who had manipulated her company. Her betrayal did not save her. The judge saw right through her desperate deflections. She was the architect of the fraud, and she received a brutal 20-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. But her testimony successfully dragged Jamal down into the abyss with her. Because his physical signature was on the documents, and because he had actively tried to cover up the breach, the judge showed him absolutely no mercy. When the gavel struck the sounding block, Jamal was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. He collapsed into his chair, weeping silently into his handcuffed hands. Valerie did not even look at him as the bailiffs marched them away through the side doors. The gallery began to clear out. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored coat, preparing to leave the courthouse, and this entire pathetic chapter behind me forever. Kendra. I stopped and turned. Brenda was standing in the aisle. She looked entirely unrecognizable. Her hair was flat and unstyled, her posture hunched, and her face deeply lined with exhaustion and stress. The fake diamonds and arrogant sneers were completely gone. She was trembling, wringing her hands together in a display of absolute desperation. "Kendra, please!" Brenda sobbed, stepping closer. "The bank took the house. They seized all of Jamal's accounts to pay the federal restitution. I have nothing left. I am going to be evicted on Monday. You have so much money now. You have the company. Please, I just need money for rent, just enough to survive." I looked at the woman who had mocked my cooking, insulted my home, and actively encouraged her son to abandon his newborn children for a wealthy mistress. I reached smoothly into my designer handbag and pulled out a small, glossy brochure. I held it out to her. Brenda gasped in relief, her hands shaking as she reached out, clearly expecting a check or a business card for a wealth manager. She took the brochure and looked down at it. It was a pamphlet for a local state-run homeless shelter on the south side of the city. Brenda's breath hitched. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with shock and fresh tears. I leaned in close, ensuring my voice was barely more than a whisper. "Make sure you wear a hat," I said. I turned my back on her and walked out of the courtroom, never looking back. 1 year later, the world looked entirely different. I stood in the center of my massive corner office, the floor-to-ceiling glass windows offering a breathtaking panoramic view of the Washington, D.C. skyline. The space was a masterpiece of modern design, featuring imported mahogany desks, sleek leather seating, and advanced encrypted workstations. But the most important part of the room was the plush heated rug situated right in the center. Malik and Maya, now walking and babbling with bright, endless energy, were playing happily with a set of wooden building blocks. Their laughter filled the office, a sound of absolute peace and untouchable security. They were safe, they were thriving, and they would never ever know the feeling of being discarded. The heavy oak doors to my office swung open and General Sterling marched in. The 4-star general was a man of immense authority, but as he crossed the room, his stern face broke into a warm, genuine smile. He stopped directly in front of my desk and offered a crisp, highly respectful salute. "Madam CEO," General Sterling said, his voice rumbling with pride. He handed me a thick, leather-bound portfolio. "The Pentagon has officially signed off. Your international expansion contracts are finalized and fully funded. Aegis Corps is now the primary cybersecurity provider for our allied forces across Europe. Congratulations, Kendra. You earned every single piece of this." "Thank you, General," I replied, accepting the portfolio. "We are just getting started." He smiled, nodded respectfully to the twins on the rug, and saw himself out, closing the heavy doors behind him. I walked over to the glass windows and looked out at the city. It was the middle of December, and thick, heavy snow was falling over the capital, blanketing the streets in brilliant white. I took a sip of my coffee, feeling a profound, unbreakable sense of power radiating through my chest. They thought they could break me. Jamal, Valerie, Brenda, Chloe. They genuinely believed I was just a weak, compliant, stay-at-home mother they could strip of her dignity and throw out into the cold to freeze. They underestimated my brilliance, they underestimated my resolve, and they vastly underestimated a mother's capacity for warfare when her children are threatened. They didn't realize they were throwing an apex predator into the wild. I didn't just survive the winter, I bought the entire season. The flashing bulbs of the White House press pool reflected off the polished mahogany podium, casting rapid, blinding shadows across the Pentagon's briefing room. I stood perfectly still, letting the sheer weight of the moment settle over the gathered journalists, military officials, and federal directors. My tailored white suit was a deliberate armor, a visual testament to my absolute, unshakable control amidst the chaos I had just unleashed. I leaned into the microphone, my voice steady, carrying the cold, clinical authority of a woman who had just conquered an empire. "We are proud to secure this nation's defense," I stated, the acoustics of the room amplifying every syllable. National security cannot and will not be entrusted to organizations crippled by gross negligence, internal corruption, and fraudulent leadership. I paused, allowing the silence to stretch. I looked directly into the center news camera, knowing that miles away in a rapidly foreclosing penthouse, my ex-husband was staring back at me. Furthermore, I continued offering a razor-sharp, uncompromising smile. My company, Aegis Core, has officially acquired the remaining viable assets of Valerie Sterling's firm for pennies on the dollar, effective at 6 o'clock this morning. We now own their infrastructure, we own their contracts, and we will be cleaning house. Just off camera, standing in the shadows of the briefing room, was Special Agent Harris, the lead investigator for the Department of Defense's Cyber Division. I reached beneath the podium and retrieved a thick sealed manila folder. Without breaking eye contact with the press, I slid the folder smoothly across the polished wood, directly into Harris's waiting hands. He knew exactly what it contained: the raw, unencrypted data I had extracted from Chloe's stolen flash drive. It held the irrefutable, hard-coded proof of Valerie's offshore Cayman Island embezzlement ledgers, alongside the exact digital footprints of Jamal's pathetic, unauthorized attempt to hack the federal defense grid. I had just handed the federal government the murder weapon, the fingerprints, and the signed confession, all in one neat package. Harris gave me a curt nod and tapped his earpiece, signaling the tactical teams that were already lying in wait. I glanced down at my encrypted tablet resting out of sight. The live surveillance feed from Valerie's penthouse was a masterpiece of human destruction. Jamal was hyperventilating, his chest heaving as he stumbled backward, tripping over a packing box. Valerie was screaming hysterically, tearing at her unwashed hair, entirely broken by the realization that her company, her wealth, and her freedom had been legally executed by the woman she thought was beneath her. Brenda was still unconscious on the velvet couch, while Chloe was frantically sprinting toward the front double doors, desperately trying to flee before the consequences arrived. She didn't make it. Through the live audio feed on my tablet, a deafening metallic boom echoed through the penthouse. Chloe shrieked, stumbling backward onto the marble entryway as the heavy double doors violently shuddered. Valerie froze, her manic screams catching in her throat. Jamal dropped to the floor, his hands covering his ears in pure terror. A second massive boom followed, the distinct, unmistakable sound of a heavy tactical battering ram striking reinforced steel. "Federal agents, open the door!" A booming voice echoed from the hallway, loud enough to be picked up by every hidden microphone in the room. I watched with profound satisfaction as the front doors splintered and burst completely off their hinges. A dozen heavily armed federal agents in dark tactical gear flooded into the luxury penthouse, their weapons drawn, shouting overlapping commands that completely drowned out Jamal's pathetic, sobbing pleas. The heavy glass doors of Valerie's luxury high-rise slid open smoothly as I stepped into the sprawling marble lobby. Outside, the freezing morning air was fractured by the spinning red and blue lights of half a dozen federal tactical vehicles blocking the street. Inside, the usually serene and pristine lobby had been transformed into a chaotic staging ground. Heavily armed agents stood by the elevators, their radios crackling with secure comms. I stood near the center of the room, waiting. The brass elevator doors dinged and slid apart, revealing a scene of absolute humiliating defeat. Federal agents marched Valerie out first. Her hands were secured tightly in heavy steel cuffs behind her back. She was thrashing wildly, screaming threats at the officers about her lawyers and her corporate rights, but her voice was hoarse and entirely powerless. The agents ignored her, practically dragging her toward the spinning lights outside. Then came Jamal. He was dead weight between two massive federal agents. His expensive suit was torn at the shoulder, his tie hung loosely around his neck, and his face was a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked completely shattered, a man who had finally realized the catastrophic price of his own blind greed. Behind him, Brenda was wailing. She had not been arrested, but she was entirely collateral damage. She fell to her knees right there on the polished marble floor of the lobby, clutching her counterfeit designer purse, sobbing hysterically as she watched her golden boy being hauled away like a common criminal. The wealthy residents of the building who had gathered to watch the spectacle whispered and pointed, completely stripping Brenda of the artificial high-class status she worshipped so deeply. Out of the corner of my eye, I spotted Chloe. She was pressed flat against a marble pillar near the concierge desk, desperately trying to blend into the shadows and escape the building unnoticed. She looked terrified, clutching her cheap coat around her trembling shoulders. I did not even bother acknowledging her existence. As the agents hauled Jamal toward the revolving doors, his bloodshot eyes darted frantically around the room and locked onto mine. He stopped dead in his tracks, forcing the agents to yank him forward. His eyes widened in absolute shock. He saw the white power suit. He saw the cold, unbroken authority radiating from my posture. The sheer desperation broke whatever was left of his pride. Jamal dropped violently to his knees, right in the middle of the lobby, dragging the two federal agents down with him. "Kendra, please!" he screamed, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. He strained against the steel cuffs, tears streaming down his face as he begged like a cornered animal. Tell them I'm your husband. Please, Kendra, save me. I didn't know what she was doing. Save me." The federal agents paused, looking at me for confirmation. I took a slow, deliberate step forward. The lobby fell dead silent, the only sound the soft click of my heels against the marble. I looked down at him, a pathetic, shivering mess on the floor. I slowly raised my wrist and adjusted the face of my diamond watch, checking the time with absolute clinical indifference. I met his desperate, pleading gaze and delivered the killing blow. "My ex-husband," I corrected, my voice ringing clear and cold through the massive room. "And as your mother so elegantly put it, take your baggage and get out." Weeks later, the air inside the federal courthouse felt heavy and stale. I sat quietly in the back row of the gallery, completely unnoticed by the frantic legal teams scrambling at the defense tables. Resting in my lap was a thick sealed manila envelope. It did not contain corporate espionage or federal indictments. It contained the finalized judge-ordered sole custody papers for my twins. Jamal's parental rights had been completely and permanently severed. He was no longer a father. He was just a federal inmate number. The sentencing hearing was an absolute bloodbath. Valerie had immediately turned on Jamal the second the feds offered her a plea deal. She threw him entirely under the bus, submitting audio recordings and forged emails to prove that Jamal was the one who authorized the illegal server bypasses and signed the fraudulent financial ledgers. She painted him as a rogue, ambitious executive who had manipulated her company. Her betrayal did not save her. The judge saw right through her desperate deflections. She was the architect of the fraud, and she received a brutal 20-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. But her testimony successfully dragged Jamal down into the abyss with her. Because his physical signature was on the documents, and because he had actively tried to cover up the breach, the judge showed him absolutely no mercy. When the gavel struck the sounding block, Jamal was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. He collapsed into his chair, weeping silently into his handcuffed hands. Valerie did not even look at him as the bailiffs marched them away through the side doors. The gallery began to clear out. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored coat, preparing to leave the courthouse and this entire pathetic chapter behind me forever. Kendra. I stopped and turned. Brenda was standing in the aisle. She looked entirely unrecognizable. Her hair was flat and unstyled, her posture hunched, and her face deeply lined with exhaustion and stress. The fake diamonds and arrogant sneers were completely gone. She was trembling, wringing her hands together in a display of absolute desperation. "Kendra, please," Brenda sobbed, stepping closer. "The bank took the house. They seized all of Jamal's accounts to pay the federal restitution. I have nothing left. I am going to be evicted on Monday. You have so much money now. You have the company. Please, I just need money for rent, just enough to survive." I looked at the woman who had mocked my cooking, insulted my home, and actively encouraged her son to abandon his newborn children for a wealthy mistress. I reached smoothly into my designer handbag and pulled out a small, glossy brochure. I held it out to her. Brenda gasped in relief, her hands shaking as she reached out, clearly expecting a check or a business card for a wealth manager. She took the brochure and looked down at it. It was a pamphlet for a local state-run homeless shelter on the south side of the city. Brenda's breath hitched. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with shock and fresh tears. I leaned in close, ensuring my voice was barely more than a whisper. "Make sure you wear a hat," I said. I turned my back on her and walked out of the courtroom, never looking back. The dust had finally settled. The past was dead buried under the weight of federal indictments and sheer, unadulterated hubris. The family that had so callously thrown me away was entirely dismantled by their own greed. Fast forward a year. I stood in the center of my massive corner office, the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, offering a breathtaking panoramic view of the Washington, D.C. skyline. The space was a masterpiece of modern design, featuring imported mahogany desks, sleek leather seating, and advanced encrypted workstations that monitored the security of half the globe. But the most important part of the room was the plush, heated rug situated right in the center. Malik and Maya, now walking and babbling with bright, endless energy, were playing happily with a set of wooden building blocks. Their laughter filled the office, a sound of absolute peace and untouchable security. They were safe, they were thriving, and they would never ever know the feeling of being discarded. The heavy oak doors to my office swung open, and General Sterling marched in. The four-star general was a man of immense authority, but as he crossed the room, his stern face broke into a warm, genuine smile. He stopped directly in front of my desk and offered a crisp, highly respectful salute. "Madam CEO," General Sterling said, his voice rumbling with pride. He handed me a thick, leather-bound portfolio. "The Pentagon has officially signed off. Your international expansion contracts are finalized and fully funded. Aegis Corps is now the primary cybersecurity provider for our allied forces across Europe. Congratulations, Kendra. You earned every single piece of this." "Thank you, General," I replied, accepting the portfolio with a gracious nod. "We are just getting started." He smiled, waved respectfully to the twins on the rug, and saw himself out, closing the heavy doors behind him. I walked over to the glass windows and looked out at the city. It was the middle of December, and thick, heavy snow was falling over the capital, blanketing the streets in brilliant white. I watched the flakes catch the light of the city, feeling a profound, unbreakable sense of power radiating through my chest. They thought they could break me. Jamal, Valerie, Brenda, Chloe. They genuinely believed I was just a weak, compliant, stay-at-home mother they could strip of her dignity, rob of her future, and throw out into the cold to freeze. They thought I would quietly fade away into the background of their glamorous, stolen lives. They underestimated my brilliance. They underestimated my resolve. And they vastly underestimated a mother's capacity for total warfare when her children's security is threatened. They didn't realize they were throwing an apex predator into the wild. I didn't just survive the winter. I bought the entire season. The story of Kendra powerfully illustrates that true strength is often quiet until provoked. It teaches us the profound danger of underestimating others based on superficial judgments and arrogant assumptions. Karma in this narrative is not a mystical force, but the natural consequence of greed meeting preparation. Betrayal and cruelty build a fragile foundation that shatters when confronted with intelligence, resilience, and unyielding self-respect. Ultimately, the lesson is that a person's lowest moment can serve as the ultimate catalyst to forge an unbreakable empire, proving that the best revenge is not just survival, but monumental, unassailable success. If you loved watching this ultimate revenge unfold, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own stories of karma and taking your power back in the comments below.